I'll listen to your book on tape.
Oh, thanks. That's very kind of you. I would work harder on the accents if I was doing the whole book.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Flux.
I'm Ben McKenzie.
Welcome to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast.
Each month, we discuss one of Terry Pratchett's books with a special guest.
This month, we're discussing The Long Earth, a collaboration between Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter, which could be better known as a really literal interpretation of an episode of Neighbours.
And our guest is podcaster, writer, and editor Joel Martin. Welcome, Joel.
Hi, how you doing, Ben? How you doing, Liz?
Good, it's nice to have you back.
Yes, it's good to be back.
Yeah, and what better book to get you back for than Pratchett's return to hard science fiction? Well, sort of.
Is it his return to hard science fiction, or is he not really a big author in this one?
Oh, that's a...
Ooh.
I think we'll get to that question. I have feelings. I have feelings about this.
I definitely have some feelings about it as well, but I feel like, I won't spoil my thoughts.
Yeah.
We'll get to them, but yeah.
We will get to all of the thoughts. But Joel, it's been a while. Last time we had you on, we discussed the very first Discworld book, The Color of Magic.
Absolutely, yep.
Have you read any more Pratchett since then?
No, I've saved myself. Yeah, no, I remember talking to you guys after the podcast, and I said, all right, well, I'm probably going to read more Pratchett, but maybe I'll save it for the next episode. And I thought it was going to be the sequel, but you threw a curveball at me.
Yes.
Yeah, we like to keep things mixed up.
It's true.
Yeah, you got me on my first love, Sword and Sorcery, and now you've got me on science fiction. So yeah,
we knew how to hook you in. Hopefully, we've hooked a few readers in as well. Have you read any Stephen? This is a question that'll come up. There's several listeners asked us this as well. But have you read any Stephen Baxter?
Yes, I did. It was mostly his short stories, and I remember reading The Raft. I think it was a long while ago. Then skimming a lot of the book series. But I love his take on aliens, so that was my big thing on Baxter. It's funny, I sort of skirt hard sci-fi and I go to the weird alien section in that subgenre.
Does that mean you liked the fourth Indiana Jones?
Which one? I didn't know there was
the
a
third one, the one that's set in the 50s.
No,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Fourth Indiana Jones film. I don't know what you're talking about, Liz. It doesn't exist.
Yes, it's just
weird.
Sorry, that does sound like we're gaslighting you. We really hate the film, I think. I
think we just really hate the film, yeah.
Which is a bad use of aliens, and it's hard to do a bad use of aliens.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it just felt weird at the time that it was made to be making a film with crystal skulls as well. That's such a 1950s, 1960s, maybe 1970s thing.
Was it sponsored by the vodka brand or
No, I don't think so.
I think they missed that boat of the weird love of the retro 80s that we have now from the Marvel universe and stuff like that. And they went a bit too far back, I think.
Yeah. They should have waited till the Wonder Woman we were waiting for comes out.
Yeah. We don't know when it's going to come out right now.
It feels like it's been coming out for 5 years, but
Yes.
It feels like it's going to take longer than the 80s were for it to arrive.
Yeah.
So I'm just very excited to talk about this book. So
I am too. I don't want to blow the gaff too early, but I was really into this, and I really want to talk about it. So, and it's really long, so we should probably get into it. Shall we get into it?
Yeah, it contains multitudes. So
oh dear.
Get ready, Joel. Strap yourself in. There's going to be more.
I forgot what this is like. All right, let's go.
Maybe long enough to forget, and then reel you back in.
Yep.
Let's begin as we do with a reading of the blurb. 1917, the Western Front. Private Percy Blakeney wakes up. He is lying on fresh spring grass. He can hear bird song and the wind in the leaves and the trees. Where have the mud, blood and blasted landscape of no man's land gone. 2015, Madison, Wisconsin. Cop Monica Jansen is exploring the burned-out home of a reclusive, some say mad, others dangerous, scientist when she finds a curious gadget. A box containing some wiring, a three-way switch, and a potato. It is the prototype of an invention that will change the way mankind views its world forever. And that's an understatement, if ever there is one. It's a blurb that doesn't really say anything about the book, doesn't it?
Weird thing, mine says 1916, not 1917.
Oh. What about yours, Joel?
Yeah, 1916 on the Kindle, and I'm assuming that's a newer edition. So
who is wrong?
Oh, well, I mean, look, I'm okay. I'm happy to be wrong. I mean, they're both years in the First World War. So.
I mean, now 1917 definitely won because of the movie, which is probably a saving grace of lots of people doing history exams.
That is true.
Well, yes.
Yeah. And film studies, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, look, if there's any subject outside of studying a book where you can go, oh, I'll just watch the film, it's got to be World War I or World War II, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you could really spend a lot more time watching all of the films because they've made, like, every year in the Oscars, at least one of the Best Picture nominations is a war film.
You'd spend more time watching the films than reading a book.
You spend more time watching the films than being in the actual... No, okay.
That's probably... Well, no, I don't think that's true.
No, it has to be literally true. If you put
films.
all of the films back to back, they'd probably run for longer than the war. I reckon they would.
Really? Every single one?
Yeah,
I don't know. That seems like a lot. That's a lot of
films.
movies.
Since 1917.
Are we including
12
Russian
of them
cinema?
to make one day.
Yes, all cinema.
All cinema? All right. All right. I think you win. Yeah.
And they love making 3-hour biopics about the war, so...
That's true. You don't need many of those to make a full day. Anyway, you don't have to do it 24 hours a day for it to count. Like, we expect you to still sleep in this hypothetical nightmare scenario.
Yeah, please, listener, somebody totaled this up. Spend the next year totaling these films up and let me know. I'm very curious.
Get on the IMDb, do the maths. It'll be great. Let's get back to a different hypothetical scenario. Let's get back to the book, because this book did not start... I mean, I guess I did read the blurb, I think, before I read it, so I kind of expected what would happen at the start. But it is not quite... I don't know. This first chapter does what the blurb starts off talking about.
We got to talk about the real side of the book, which is just the picture of the stepper with no explanation, because it just plunges you straight in, and you're like, "What is this diagram?" So I thought that was a really good way to start, actually, because it raises a lot of questions, and it's not a conventional way to start a Terry Pratchett book.
Yeah, it's a cool diagram too. It reminded me of the cover of the They Might Be Giants album, Mink Car, which is this sort of little exploded diagram of like a model kit. But yeah, but I love how it doesn't come with any of the accompanying notes, so you don't know what any of the parts are.
We don't know which part goes in first. Did anyone have model kits growing up? Was anyone enthusiastic?
No, but it reminded me of, like, because I was in high school around the era that a bunch of people were building, those potato cannons.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, that made me think a lot of this, because people did meticulously pass around the way you made it, and it did involve a potato and everything, and I was just wondering if that was part of it, or if it's always because kids are involved in science kits, like making crystal radios like they mentioned in the book.
That's true, yeah. Now, this brought me back to the old, Spitfire models that I used to get in an assembly, and so that was a nice throwback again, World War II.
Would you have built a good stepper, do you think? Like, would you have been one of the people who did a good one, or would you have been one of the ones crying and wandering around and having to be rescued by Joshua?
Oh, I definitely would have built a very competently looking stepper. You just don't look inside, that's all. Yeah. So probably crying, yeah.
I don't think I would have. I wouldn't have finished one. I would have been too nervous. I think I would have tried building one, and I'd be like, "Oh, but I don't know."
But I don't know.
It tells you what it does. Yep. So maybe I would have just built one and thrown the switch. I don't know. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. So it's 1916 or 17?
Yes. Just to put that question to bed, the correct year is 1917. Later in the book, it said that Private Blackney went missing after the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which occurred in April 1917. And Percy Blackney, I realise they do specify the pronunciation of his name later in the book, so I pronounced it wrong in the blurb. But yeah, this guy, Percy Blackney, is struck by a shell and he wakes up in this other world, a weird other world where there's no people and there's no war, which is nice, but he's a bit confused. And, he's a soldier from World War One. He's not well versed in the idea of parallel universes, so he doesn't know.
Yeah, and I was very impressed by the way it was written, because in 5 pages we get all of Private Percy stuff. We care about him. We find out that he was in World War One. We find out that he's traveled to an alternate universe. We find out that where he was in the war and that he'd been injured previously and had a different post. And also in the final 2 pages, just someone's born casually. Why not? It's just, but it doesn't feel right.
It's a banger of a first chapter, isn't it? It really just gets into it.
Yeah.
I really liked it.
It just throws you straight in and you're invested immediately. And I was like, excellent. All right. I'm here.
And I don't know about you. I felt this first chapter felt very Pratchett-y.
Yeah.
From the second paragraph.
Percy feels very Terry Pratchett to me.
Yeah.
As a character, the way he interacts with the world, the way he speaks, the way he thinks about how he got there, that was very Pratchett-y to me.
Yeah. And I really enjoyed the alien, well, they're not aliens, are they? The weird creatures.
The fellows.
The fellows.
The boys.
Or as he later calls them, the Russians.
The Russians, yeah.
Which is ridiculous, but great. They reminded me, if you've read his Dark Materials, of I'm going to pronounce their name wrong, the Malefula, who are the sort of elephant people in the third book, The Amber Spyglass, just because they were big and friendly and weird.
And I like that he introduces himself by saying "Parley buffoon say," because that is just very funny, because he is the buffoon saying a thing. But it does sound like the French thing. I
assume the conversation about whether something feels Pratchett or not is probably going to be repeated quite a bit. But I think when I started it and I saw the potato, I was like, well, I'm reading a Pratchett book. And then, it was a very Pratchett opening. And then things get a little bit more murky in the middle. But the opening contrast between the war and just, him being obviously shell-shocked was really good opening.
But the thing is, if you'd handed me this book without, with a white cover with none of the authors on it and said, one of the authors is someone you haven't read before and the other one is someone you're a fan of, who do you think they are? I would have been like, all right, Jasper Fforde.
Interesting.
Okay, I can see that, actually. Yeah.
Especially because of the potato diagram at the beginning.
And the fact that it's set in the present day, which is not something Pratchett has done very often. In fact,
that was going to be my question. I was like, is this unusual for him?
Yeah, well, in fact, and it's not even set in the present day. It's set in the future.
Yeah.
Which is something his first couple of novels are set in the very, very far future, thousands and thousands of years in the future. So he can just imagine it however he wants, basically. And he's written a couple of historical novels. And the Johnny books and arguably the Truckers series are pretty much the only ones he's written contemporary in the sense of set around the time that it was written. So that's that would throw you off too, I think.
And the chapters. The fact that it's got chapters.
It's an adult book with chapters, whereas, he has written books with chapters, but they're generally speaking for younger readers, which seems to be why he puts it in. But just on the subject of it happening in the future, it took me a little while to figure out when everything was happening.
There's hop a bunch, yeah.
Because you go from World War One, where Percy ends up meeting these things, to sometime recently. And I sort of had to work it out, because there is a year mentioned in the book somewhere, but I don't know where it is. The blurb was the main place I got a year for the modern day kind of stuff, which was 2015, which was 3 years after the book was published. But that's Step Day, and most of the action actually takes place 15 years after that, so in 2030. Yeah, it's set in the future, and there's little hints of that throughout the book, but the technology level, until you get to the really crazy far-out technology stuff, is not significantly higher or different to what we know today. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. It took me a while to figure that out.
Yeah, I kind of liked how it moved around time. For this discussion, I guess we can't really go through the book in complete chronology because there's just so much. It felt to me like a book that was almost entirely world building, but in the most delightful of ways. I was very here for it being just all world building because it's just very interesting, pushing out against the boundaries of the concept. But basically every new chapter, every few chapters you meet a new character or you have a self-contained story or something. And if we went through all of it, I think we'd be here for possibly longer than those war movies.
Yeah, I think so. I did like that all of those little flashbacks to various points between Step Day and the sort of present of the story introduce new characters who then do come back later on in the main story, even if in very minor ways.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah, it was great. And I think maybe there's one or two who don't, who I assume will turn up in more significant roles in maybe some of the later books. I'm not sure.
But yeah, this is one of those books that you feel like everything is mapped out on little pieces of paper connected by red string on a wall. Like, nothing is forgotten and nothing is unintentional.
And presumably not just this book, but like the whole series of 5.
Well, because this is just setting up a series, really. It could stand alone, but it does feel like it's a lot of groundwork for something bigger to come.
It's interesting. I think looking at it like a series, I went and like did some background checks. So I cheated a bit, and it was curious. I think Pratchett himself said that they designed the series to be a sequel after a sequel. So it's sort of explaining the book that came before, rather than it being sort of a thing pays off later on. And I don't know how true that is in terms of the actual reading of it, but it's an interesting idea to think that the next book is the one that explains the one that came previously.
It's kind of a Diana Wynne Jones thing as well.
Yeah, that's a good comparison,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And this is a very Diana Wynne Jones book, as one of our commenters pointed out, but it was something I kept coming back to throughout, is that it does feel very Diana Wynne Jonesy.
Who's someone we've mentioned a lot on this pod. I think at some point we're going to have to do a spin-off episode just about her work.
Oh, I'm very keen for that. That'll be great.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do it.
But quick rundown of the plot?
Yeah, maybe that's a good way to handle this one. So, in the past, Percy Blakeney finds himself in this other world, meets some weird local creatures who are not human beings. He kind of describes them as like fat monkey bear creatures.
But he thinks of them as humans still.
Yeah. He thinks they're Russians. And makes friends with them by singing to them because they're able to mimic his singing back to him. But then, like about a century later, a 15-year-old girl named Maria Valiente, who lives in Madison, Wisconsin, also finds herself in that same other world, or at least another world. It's not actually explicitly said if it's the same one or not. And is pregnant, and she appears there just as she's giving birth. He's born, she disappears back to the regular Earth, and he's left there, newly born, just for a moment, the only sentient creature in this entire universe of a parallel world. And then she comes back and gets him, and they both go home. And as we find out later in the book, as the character finds out much later in the book, she dies soon after from complications, and he goes into an orphanage, which he refers to as just the home.
Which is where she was growing up as well.
That's right. She got sent there, but it was taken over by a bunch of sort of outcast nuns who are very Pratchett-y characters. Just every single time I just wanted to meet more of the nuns. Every time we found out more about one of them, I was like, yes, these are the best nuns.
They do get brought up a bunch too. So yeah.
The one with the meatloaf poster and the motorcycle.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that happens in that first chapter is on another world, some long time ago, not specified exactly when, a giant collection of microbes living in an inland sea in North America awakens to sentience and is also the only sentient mind on its entire world and entire universe. So there's a lot of stuff happens. Even that's just all chapter 1. This book has 52 chapters. Like, that's crazy. But then we sort of skip to what is the present of the novel, which is 2030, where everything has changed. Because as we find out through flashbacks 15 years previously, in 2015, someone anonymously releases the plans for this device, which becomes known as a stepper, onto the internet, and a bunch of kids in particular all build them, and it's just a little box with a little 3-way switch on top and a potato inside it that's hooked up to the electronics. And when you switch the switch, which is labeled off and then like in one direction east and in the other direction west, you travel from the original Earth, which becomes known as Datum Earth. I was hoping they'd come up with another phrase for it, because I find Datum Earth a bit of a mouthful to say, because it's such an odd word. We don't really use the singular of data. Like, that's not really how that word's used. But anyway, you move from that one step in whichever direction you've chosen to another Earth. And not just another Earth, but another entire universe with the moon and planets and everything else. And there's lots of them, and you can keep stepping and keep going in different directions, further and further away from the original.
As in different directions, as in either east or west. They don't tell us what happened, like why there isn't a north or a south.
Well, I think the idea is that there's just one continuum of worlds.
Yeah.
But the reason there's directions is that you have to be able to go out and go back again.
But would that just be time then? Like, would you then, if you went sideways into one, then you went north or south, would that be traveling through time?
I think in one of the references, it was like they're not specifically referencing a direction. It was just the way that it helps people think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just to say, like, we've got to think about this as some kind of direction. Let's put some direction labels we're familiar with on them.
Like there's a cement ceiling on travel, and there is just direct... Okay.
Yeah, because the theory... And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because this is such several listeners asked about how we thought it compared to other depictions of parallel universes. And for me, it's totally different to all of them, because the whole thing about it is that all these Earths are similar but different, but the main thing that's different is there are no people in any of them. They're all empty of human life.
Usually the joy is like the slight differences in history and that kind of thing. And I would have, if I was setting out to write this book, I'd be like, what am I going to possibly put in this? Like, that will be interesting.
Yeah, how do you fill it up?
Yeah. And they delivered in spades. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that means it sidesteps the cliche of parallel universe stories.
Oof.
No, I didn't even mean that one. But there's that line fairly early on where there's like somebody talking about how the Long Earth works on television in universe, and is saying, and Adolf Hitler has not been allowed to win his war in any of these worlds. Yep. And you're like, yeah, good. I mean, I'm okay with that. But it is weird.
It's strange. And it is a very interesting exploration of like, what if humans were given this information and ability suddenly, what would they do with it? And I feel like it does actually do a really thorough and authentic exploration of that without feeling forced or cramped at any point.
Yeah, and I think it was really smart for them to do it out of order. It's not told linearly. We have chapters of what the main characters are getting up to in the present, but then we flash back to things like Step Day a few times, or just after Step Day, or 5 years after, or 10 years after, and we see this sort of gradual evolution. And if anything, I think the only thing that I found disappointing about that is how American-centric it was. Like, they've chosen to set the novel, like the main location that's significant is Madison, Wisconsin, where the main character is from, where the guy who invented the stepper box is from. And so it becomes this kind of central idea of this is where stepping started, even though it's obviously spread over the world very quickly. But there's little bits of what happens in other countries, but not a lot. I assume there's something that will get explored more in some of the later books.
Well, they said in the acknowledgements why they chose Wisconsin as the location, because they were at the North American Discworld Convention, and they wanted to do a lot of research. But I am disappointed because, like, as you say, a lot of stories like this are very American-centric. I did see a tweet that made me laugh because of, the current apocalypse and everything, where they say you're watching... When you watch a zombie movie and it's just Americans all killing each other and society's crumbled, and they never mention what other countries are doing, it's because other countries have like recovered and are just going on with normal life.
Well, interestingly, this book like suggests almost the opposite. Like, they specifically talk about how America deals with this quite well, but other countries don't, and they're quite like it's UK? Very down on the United Kingdom.
Yeah, England gets absolutely.
Yeah, like there's a line where they say only 3 countries tried to ban stepping, and it was Iran, Burma, and the United Kingdom.
Australia gets a strangely prominent role in this.
Yeah,
I have to say film, but it featured quite a lot. And what do you think? Like, I thought it was good, but also interesting how they handled it.
Oh, the depiction of Australia, you mean?
They had a section where Indigenous Australians are talking about how they can step sideways and with the pros and cons of that. They have their own chapter dedicated to that idea.
In the book, they said they were the largest, what is it, the majority of people that went,
like a higher percentage of them than any other ethnic group left and never came back.
Yeah, which sort of ended at the end of a chapter as well. So it sort of was this big reveal, and then you're left wondering. And that's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's kind of like when we were reading The Last Continent. I would love to get an Aboriginal perspective on that, because I can sort of see pros and cons of that, both as a decision, but also as like a depiction of what Aboriginal people might do or think. Yeah.
Yeah, but looking at the overall plot, the way that it advances, we meet Joshua, who's now sort of older, and he is a natural stepper. He can move without the box, and he's been recruited for several things in the past. He ran into some trouble with the government over an incident, and he's been offered the chance to have that incident wiped clean if you'll go on this other mission with Lobsang, who claims to be a reincarnated Tibetan motorcycle repairman, but is pretty much just AI revealing itself.
Yeah, and it's a very clever sequence where he kind of explains that this is how he got around the difficulty of claiming that he was as good as a human being by saying he was actually a human being.
And originally he presents himself as a vending machine, as you would, I guess, and excretes a drink, which is sure a strong image.
Dr. Pepper, yeah.
Yeah. But they decide to go on a journey to find the end of the long earth, isn't it? Isn't that the classic thing? Like,
well, he kind of just says like he wants to explore it and find out what more about it and how it works. He's a bit circumspect about it in the beginning, I think.
Yeah, but they basically, long story short, they set off on this journey, and much of the book of their story is them going and exploring different lands along the way, kind of like the Stargate team mixed with the Prometheus team, but with less incidents, and just kind of a nice odd couple vibe. It's also got some Hitchhiker's Guide feels to it as well.
Yeah. Like an older example, probably like a little Jules Verne. I couldn't escape that in the book.
Well, there's a direct reference when they meet Sally towards the end of the book, and she refers to one of them as Robur. And you're like, because they make an airship that, and it's like a Zeppelin, but it's a big fancy one. It's huge, like the way that they describe it. It's got multiple decks and all these rooms.
And a cat.
And laser cannons. Yeah.
And a cat. It's got a robot cat who's cool. And they managed to get that to travel through getting around the loopholes of how stepping works. And I thought that was really interesting too, because there's a lot of little nuances about how stepping between the earths works that felt to me, because normally I read Pratchett and I read, his fantasy work, and it feels to me more like science fiction, whereas this is science fiction, but in some ways felt to me a little bit more like fantasy, because you've got these kind of weird magic rules of how the world works that nobody understands why it's like that.
Yeah, like the whole iron can't travel between the things was interesting. Like, I wonder how they came up with that specifically, because it seems like I don't know how iron is made though. Is that why there's a whole thing called the Iron Age, because it was a big breakthrough in human technology? Like, does iron not exist naturally? Because well,
being able to work it does exist naturally as an ore.
But does that mean you could put iron ore through, or like could you take?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
So I thought
they
if
do go into it a bit.
Then that would make sense. But yeah.
There's a whole chapter where they explain that as well, when they're talking about like iron in the blood and it needs to be contained within, our molecules to go through.
I had that down as a note. I'm like, what about iron in the blood? And then they had a whole thing about that.
Yeah.
So I was like, thank you for reading my mind and my nitpicky questions ahead of time.
I think that's partly they probably picked that because they knew they wanted the Long Earth to be a kind of explanation for a lot of folk tales. And iron is long, associated with being a bane for fairy creatures, the Fae, the Sidhe, the Tuatha De Danann, like they can't touch iron.
They have a whole real mean thing about Stonehenge. It's like, that's mean.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Like,
the singing stones,
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Keep them out. Yeah. You just bang them to make them unhappy with the sound. I'm like, that's just so mean. The trolls are nice.
Yeah.
Well, stone has a purpose, I suppose. That was the purpose, to traumatize the trolls. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like one of those things that, like a bug zapper, or like the thing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we don't know if Stonehenge was built for that. We only know that this other circle of stones was built for that, which it seems like it was.
Mm-hmm.
The journey, though, that they go on, we discover these rules as they go, but there's a lot of rules that they already know. But part of the impetus for this journey is that nobody understands why these rules are the way they are, and they're hoping to resolve some of that mystery. And it's a secret at the start that Joshua is a natural stepper, that he doesn't need the box to do it. But it's also heavily implied early on. Well, I thought it was implied early on, so it wasn't that much of a surprise to me when they kind of more or less say it out loud later on, that all humans are natural steppers, or most of them. It's just that most of them need the box to get their mind into the right frame to do it.
This is the thing about the brain potential not being unlocked, etc., etc.
Yeah, and then there's that, because there's like 1/5 who can just do it pretty naturally. They don't need the box, and they don't feel ill when they do it. And then everyone else can do it with a box, but it makes them feel like they get, one of the big things is when you step across, you feel nauseous for like 10 to 15 minutes and you throw up and it's gross. And then there's like about 1 in 5, or maybe it was more like 10%, but there's another significant proportion of people
that can't step,
who you just can't do it. Although, as you find out right at the end of the book, and I thought this was interesting that this was a detail that was left right until the end. They can do it. Like, they can be taken across by someone else.
They just get really sick.
So it's not that they can't travel. It's just they can't travel on their own, which I thought was like kind of an important point.
Yeah,
and seemed
weird
to leave out until the end.
Yeah, I agree.
Because do they stay sick if they're not in their own world, or could you because the whole thing is that people leave their phobic, as they call them, kids behind as they explore new worlds, which is
that
crappy.
made me so sad and
But
angry.
if it's just they get really sick and need like an EpiPen or something when they land, like surely you do it once.
Yeah.
And then...
Is it like a coma kind of sick? Or is it just like, a week of being sick? Because if it's a week of being sick, then I have no sympathy for the family that left their son behind. It's just...
I guess they did like 100,000 steps. So you'd have to...
Oh yeah, that would ruin you.
Yeah. Be sick for like...
slow you down.
That much time. So.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah. I did because early on I was really confused about why anyone felt the need to go that far from the original Earth. But as the book goes on and these flashbacks sort of fill in more information, and I was like making notes. I mean, you've seen some of my notes, which are a bit ridiculous, but I was making some other notes. They explain that the Earth is in the interglacial zone. So the original Earth and the ones close to it are all in a sort of band of Earths that are very similar. And they sort of, there's these groupings of Earths that are broadly similar to each other. But the Earth is an interglacial one, so it's had some ice ages, but those ice ages have left it kind of fertile after they've gone, so now it's nice. And then there's the ice belt they refer to, which is like, I think it's like something like 100,000 Earths or something, where it's not that many actually, it's fewer than that, it's like 20,000, but there's about that many Earths going west where it's all ice age and there's no, you can't grow anything and the animals are all weird. And then you get past that and there's the mine belt, which is there's not much vegetation, there's lots of mineral resources but not much life. And then once you get past that, which
Corn
is
belt,
where you get to the 100,000s, the Corn Belt, where the conditions are really perfect for farming and plants and animals to thrive. Yeah, so they kind of eventually explain that. I'm like, oh, that's why you got to go so far.
And the worlds are kind of set up to be that kind of, American pioneer going into the West. And I had this feeling when I was reading it, and there's the references to this all the time. We see Daniel Boone rather. And I got that feeling of, old Westerns that I grew up with, of the lack of irons. Then you sort of contrivance to make these, long walking hikes across wilderness to get that sort of aesthetic across. And yeah, because
they had that story of the family that was traveling that left their kid behind, and that was the one with that aesthetic the most, I think.
Yeah, the pioneer aesthetic, yeah.
I think what this book did really well in its world building was also showing different ways that different types of people would handle this new power or ability, because there were the people who wanted to regress to older times where women did the chores and men did the hunting and gathering and that kind of thing. They're the people who would have immediately tried to make a buck, and you got that guy who tried to find gold. Everyone's got gold now. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And then there's the scientists or the big rich people like Lobsang works for, essentially, who want to answer the bigger questions and have the resources to do so. So you got to see things on a micro and a macro level of how humanity would handle such a thing. And then the resentfulness of the aftermath of this new world as well. So it packs a lot in. Like, it's a compelling read in terms of the story alone. But as an exploration of how humans would handle this, I think it was very real.
It was very positive as well. There was a sense of optimism, which reminded me of the golden age of science fiction, much less than the current sort of bent towards science fiction, whether that be dystopia or, Neil Stephenson style. And I'll mention him a lot, I guess, during this. But there is that level of optimism, and characters are generally more hopeful in this book.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. It didn't feel grim. Like, it wasn't like there's a horror waiting around every corner. It was kind of like Stargate vibe.
Yeah, I did like there wasn't a lot of military or government sort of presence. Like, they referenced, but most of the characters like to operate independently, and where they do sort of end up working with government or with large corporations, they're very wary of it. Like, they don't like it. But certainly most of the protagonists are like that anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was even like that horrible slaughter scene, and it wasn't actually like humans doing like a zombie movie on each other. It was just animals that can sidestep, finding themselves trapped in a confined space and just reacting in a natural way. So, cause I was like, oh, it's going to take a dark turn where humans are suddenly like going around trying to murder other colonies, but it was not that at all. And I was pleasantly surprised. I was pleasantly surprised by the murder.
We never got to the chapter where they like teleported into a Aztec style civilization where the apes were running around sacrificing hearts or anything. Like, we never got to that extent.
No.
It was always sort of benign. Yeah.
Can we talk about the monkey motif throughout this, which I feel a bit of a noob being like, maybe it's explained in the subsequent books, but there is like a strong monkey motif, like from the trolls, like looking kind of monkeyish.
Yeah. Is that just Neanderthal, like sort of Homo sapien evolutionary scale thought process here? That's what I agree assume. With that.
But there's also like Joshua's mother, and they don't explain his father, has that monkey bracelet that is precious to her and the only thing she got from her mother.
That's a good point.
And it's kind of just like a thing throughout. And I was wondering, like, is it, like you're saying, evolution, because they have that whole section about evolution being that we can't find fossils of certain links in the chain that we feel like we should be, and the book's explanation is because those people could step and they stepped away from datum Earth, and that's why there is so little fossil evidence of them. So
I found that bit a bit fuzzy. Like, I wasn't sure if they were suggesting all of the stepping kind of intelligent life forms evolved on the main Earth and then left, or if they were saying we can't figure out how all these other beings evolved on the other Earths, because as soon as they could step, they left, so they don't leave any trace in the fossil record. So I was a bit fuzzy on that. But I do think that, most of them are ape-like in some way because they're supposed to have a common ancestor with humans.
Can I just get
they've come from a similar line
into my most interpretation mode for this? Because in that chapter, actually, it opened up a lot of things, because they had that character Nelson, who was sort of had one foot in religion and one foot in science. Yep. And I felt like that kind of summed up the book a bit, because at the end of it, I was like, hang on. So the main character is called Joshua, and he has got a kind of chosen one vibe, right? Like, he is the one who was born for a specific thing. Joshua...
He's very Campbellian in his sort of... he's got the weird origin and et cetera, et cetera.
All right, so let me get into my like full thing. Joshua is actually like a modern version of Yeshua, which is another name for Jesus. Yep. His mother is named Maria, and we don't know who the father is. I assume that's going to be a big reveal later, or it's a virgin birth. It was just kind of real Bible-y Jesus things.
Yeah,
put it a certain way.
I got that exact vibe, yeah.
Yeah, because he's literally called Joshua. His mother is Maria, and I was like, surely that's intentional.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, look, one thing I will say, I did go back and read the short story, which was Terry Pratchett's original version of this, which he wrote in 1986, like before the Discworld took off. He thought this would be his big series. He thought this was going to be the books he was going to write. There was going to be this whole thing.
Until The Color
of
Magic.
The Color of Magic got real popular, so he's like, well, I'll write the one that I know is already popular. So he came up with a lot of this stuff. And back in that, like, one of the characters is called Joshua Valiente. It's got the same name. One of the other main characters, his last name is Lindsay, although he's quite different. And the characters, I should say, in that short story are different, but a lot of the ideas are already there. So you're right, like, it does have that feel to it, but I wonder if that's something that's been added in, because a lot of the ideas that are in the novel were already there in the short story, including things like the gap and the high megas. I mean, that's what the story's called. It's called the high megas. And a lot of that stuff is already in place, even when he originally came up with the idea, like long before he wrote this book.
Yeah, I think it was the name, I think, that really tipped me off, like you, Liz, I guess. When, like Joshua, it's that whole dual name of God thing going on in the name. But specifically, I don't know how common Joshua is as an American name. Do we know? Is that what?
Well, they're Catholics.
Yeah.
And they were in a home for Catholic kids, so I assume that those sorts of biblical names are pretty common for them, at least. It made sense in that score.
But it is a book that is about science and religion. Like, he literally grows up in a home, like you said, like a Catholic home with nuns and everything, but it is a very science book. Like, it talks about how it works and all of that kind of thing. So, like, I feel like it's intentional, even if he was called Joshua in the... Like, is his mother mentioned in the short story? Because that could have been added in later. It might not have been intentional in the short story, but...
Yeah, Maria, in the short story, the Joshua style character is actually Larry Lindsay, and Joshua Valiente in the short story is like a different character.
And so switching them around could fit in with that theory as well. So yeah, it's evolution, religion, all of those things coming together. And there's even that, and this is a bit of a stretch, is that whole thing where they flash back to the war about people trying to protect themselves or loved ones trying to protect them with the Bible in the pocket, like the classic one. But it's got a gunmetal cover, and one of the sergeants is yelling at someone else, being like, if you get shot in that, it will shoot the gunmetal right into you and hurt you more. So like, it's actually more dangerous to hold that close to your heart. And I was like, is that real? And I was just wondering if that is part of the overall thing.
We have a few references in the book that's, biblical or sort of Christian imagery. Like there was a line that made me chuckle, which was a hero leading them to safety like Moses, only he was called Joshua, not Moses. And if people don't know, Joshua was the sort of right-hand man to Moses in the Torah. So again, you have all these sort of allusions. So I didn't know if it was just sort of a nod or a wink, or whether it was more than that.
I feel like it's a nod. It's not like, let's make this like a parable or a retelling of something.
I don't think so,
I feel like it's an intentional thread.
Yeah, I think Joshua does turn out to be very central, and for particular, specific, unique reasons. But I don't think he's really a Christ figure. Like, he stands a bit aside. I mean, it's hard to tell because there's 4 more books of this, and it's not sure where it's going. I mean, well, it's sure where it's going. I'm not sure where it's going. But I mean, the religious themes come through in the character of Lobsang as well, who uses the whole idea of reincarnation as the basis for his argument that he should be treated like a human being, because, he says he is one, but also he tries to live by Buddhist tenets,
And the most religious, non-religious group are the comic atheists, the ones who get slaughtered. Like, they actually have a church for their atheism and that kind of thing. And that whole bit felt very Terry Pratchett as well. But I don't feel like it's pushing in any one direction of religion, but I do feel like the religion versus science, not versus, like religion and science coexisting is a thread.
I don't think it was a conflict in the book. Like, it wasn't set up as a conflict. It never became one. But like, even Lobsang, he has plenty of sort of illusions of grandeur. You have the whole, omnipotence that gets brought up so many times with him. And curious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel we should talk a bit more about the plot, because we do like to try and make sure someone who hasn't read the book can follow what we're talking about, at least vaguely.
This is a hell of a one to do that for,
Yeah.
I know, because there's so much in it, and it's told all, like we said, out of sequence.
But the plot is pretty basic, to be honest. It's world building that's complex.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah, the plot is, you can step sideways into different alternative Earths, and how do different people handle it. Our protagonists are exploring the bigger questions of this. And everyone else is just filling in the gaps about how society's dealing with it. That's kind of the plot. Like, they go on this big journey. He finds a woman who... Should we talk about Sally, or do we get to Sally later?
I think we can talk about Sally. We're not really going to try and go through this in order, I feel, for once.
So Joshua and Lobsang are on their journey. They come across a young woman who turns out to be Sally, who is the daughter of the man who originally... put the diagram on the internet that started everyone stepping, that caused Step Day, and it turns out that she is from a family of natural steppers. Her dad was not able to do it without the box, and he got slowly more reclusive after her mother died, and it was just... Like, what was his motivation? Like, I found it difficult. Like, was it that he felt that everyone should have the information?
Yeah, because he was working for the Black Corporation, which is a big multinational corporation that owns Trans-Earth, which is the company that Lobsang part owns, and which has paid for all of their amazing technology that they build into their Zeppelin and go off traveling across the worlds in. And he could see what was going to happen is that as he developed this box that could allow people to step, he was doing it on his own, not for the Black Corporation, but he could see that the Black Corporation would get there and get their hands on it, and he didn't want that to happen, so he released it to the public instead, made sure it got out to everyone, and then no one could own it because it had an anonymous author and everybody had access to the information.
Yeah.
And he'd also been doing all these weird experiments of figuring out how it would work and how he could get other people to go across and how he could make a thing, because it is pretty much spelt out in the book that everyone... the box doesn't do the stepping, the person does the stepping, but the box makes it possible for them.
Yeah.
Which is a contrast to the original short story where they don't have a box, they have a belt, and the belt seems integral, like you have to have it. But it's important because it has safety features. Like there's stuff missing from the short story that they've integrated into here. Like in the short story, there's a lot of questions that are not answered, but there's lots of stuff in there. But anyway,
there's more fodder for a series if it's inherent in humans rather than just technology allowing it, because then you can go back further. there's more questions you can probe into. Like there's a lot more depth if it's not just technology allowing them to do that.
Yeah, have people step before, and then where have they gone, etc., etc.
Which is sort of touched on in this book about how Sally takes them to what's it called again? Like Happy Landings?
Happy Landings.
And
that's what she calls it.
It's funny because throughout the book, we've heard of people stepping like, oh, that place was full of rain, so we'll step one more. And it turns out this is the place that's constantly raining, and it's actually just almost a kind of utopia where everyone looks after each other. And it's easy to live there because they don't have to work as hard to farm for food.
Yeah, a strange utopia, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's sort of a thing that comes back, this idea that if agriculture is required if you only have one world, because once your population reaches a kind of certain size, you have to get more serious about food production in a smaller area, or you can't feed everybody. But once you can spread out to the long Earth and you can have a very small number of people living on an entire planet, we don't even need to farm. Like there's plenty of food to sustain you just growing wild. And that's particularly true of the world where Happy Landings is, and that's like really far off into the high megas, to use the phrase from the original story. It's at about 1.4 million steps removed from Earth, and the other significant thing about it is that it is a community that's not just humans; it's humans and trolls living side by side. And it's by around this time in the book we've learned that trolls is the name that people use to refer to the weird monkey ape-like creatures that Private Percy meets when
the Russians
he accidentally steps. Yeah, the so-called Russians. Yeah, and like it's a good reminder that like back in those days, the people had never gone overseas. They didn't have television. They didn't have photographs from anywhere else. And if you weren't very educated, there's no reason for them not to believe that human beings in other parts of the world look very, very different to you. And I was like, that's true.
It was curious. I was reading I was on a World War II bend, which is, I recommend that to no one because that's a misery hole and a half. But there was an interesting thing about Russians from a German perspective, or rather Nazi propaganda perspective, where they depicted them as, subhuman, sort of, ape-like, bear-like creatures. And I kind of got that vibe from his Percy's description of it as well, where it's sort of like removing them because they're the other, they're the enemy. So.
He had so much propaganda thrown at him as a soldier who had not left his small town, small country. So, yeah.
And him deciding sort of not wanting to go back to that world just because you sort of understand why he wouldn't.
Yeah. I like that he decides in the end, 40 years later, to go back and see how the wars got on.
See how his chaps are doing. Yeah.
And he immediately gets mown down and dies. So,
by a tractor.
He gets hit by a tractor. That is not a good way to go.
Hit by iron.
That is... Oh... And that's a message in that. It's like maybe if you found something good, you should stay there. But I don't know if that's intentional or if it's just for because it's good because Lobsang pieces together all these stories that show you how this has worked across recent history, and his is one of them. And it's weird because when he mentioned Percy, I was like, oh, I know that guy. I'm like, wait, no, it's all the same book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was so long ago. Once you get back to him in that later chapter, you're like, oh, I wondered if this was going to be significant in some way.
It always was, pretty much. And the raining one, which is just such a throwaway thing. Like, oh, we won't go there because it's raining. It reminds me of that Simpsons episode where when he presses the toaster every time, he's in a different alternate universe. And I don't know why this episode has stuck with me of all of them, but there's that one where everything is perfect. Like, he's wealthy. He's got it's the classic 80s, 90s version of perfection, where you have lots of money in a big house and very polite family. And then he's like, may I have a donut? And they're like, what is a donut? And he's like, and he starts screaming and immediately runs for the toaster. And then suddenly it starts raining donuts and they're like, oh, it's raining again. So, yeah. Thank you for coming on that journey with me where I described that scene that you all already knew. But it kind of reminds me of that. Like, they all were like, oh, it's raining, so we can't go here. And they missed out on a nice place. But is the self
Well, we don't know. We don't know if they missed out on a nice place.
Well, because it's sort of
because they don't explore it.
Yeah, but there's also that kind of thing where no one bad goes there, so it is kind of like in Harry Potter, where Muggles always remember they've got something they need to do when they're trying to enter the area where the Triwizard Tournament is. Yeah. So it might be just keeping people out.
It's no one bad, but also it makes references to disability and things like that as well. Like there's sort of queasy territory.
Yeah, I saw that. I was like, oh no, you're not saying what I think you're saying, and they stopped talking about it. I'm like, I think,
and they stopped talking about it. Yeah.
Well, I don't think they were like.
I don't think they were.
The main characters
yeah.
are sort of discussing it, going, "Isn't it weird though?
Isn't it weird?
There's no disabled people here. Like, where is it? What? How does that work?" And they're like, "Yeah, that is weird." And they're unsettled by it, and it's part of what makes them feel like there's something off about that community.
Yeah.
Which I liked, because it's an acknowledgement that in these stories, you so rarely see anyone who is disabled doing anything, and the closest that kind of comes in the book is the way that people treat the standalones, or whatever they end up calling them.
It's a horrible way to call them, because it's not what they are.
Yeah. And that whole subplot where the Green family, who go to what they eventually name this sort of town of Reboot in this universe, which belongs to them, they leave their son behind. And the dad talks about how he can't quite believe, like in one of the early chapters, he talks about how he can't quite believe his wife has become someone who's willing to do that.
Yeah.
And then he goes along with it and does it as well, although he insists on having a connection back to the original Datum Earth and making sure that he's looked after, which his wife is disapproving of. And I'm like, this is horrifying.
Yeah,
like, this pushed some real buttons for me, who's had like some stuff like that, in my family history, and I'm like, no, this is not okay. And I felt real sorry for Rod. I mean, where he goes is like awful, but
you can sort of, it's understandable to a degree. Like they laid the groundwork for how his story arc panned out very well.
Yeah. So they do meet Sally, who takes them to Happy Landings, but she also refuses to tell them how she's managed to step so far, because this is another thing, is that Lobsang's invention of this special airship allows them to step very, very quickly, because, you have to go one universe at a time, or most people do, as we discover later on. And, particularly if you suffer from the nausea, like if you're one of most of the humans using a stepper box, that means you can't go that far very quickly. They do sort of a few hundred steps a day, or normal people do. And then if you sort of condition yourself, like I think the Green family, when they're doing it, do about 1,000 a day. And then there's the airship, which can do like one every second at a sort of easy cruising speed, which is 40,000 a day, which gets them very far. And then they find Sally out at like 1.4 million, and they're like, how the hell did you get this far so quickly? And she doesn't want to tell them about it.
Yeah, and that interaction is very good as well.
Yeah.
Entice her onto the ship.
Yeah, that was great. And I also really like that there was very much a feeling of, are they going to be like a romance? Is this going to be a typical Pratchett, like two people get together just because they're the only two people and we're not going to really like it kind of thing? Yeah. And then it doesn't happen. And you're like, oh, this is refreshing.
Yeah.
It was really good. And she's quite adamant about it. She's like, no, not interested. Because he does make that one comment about her legs at one point and then instantly regrets it. She's like, why did I say that? That was a dumb thing to say. And she's like, listen, mate, we might become friends, but that's all that's going to happen here. And you're like, okay, good. And nobody gets pissy about it or weird. But they find out weird things like that the trolls don't like to be around people. And this hooks back into, or too many people, I should say. In fact, through experimentation, the people who live in Happy Landings have discovered that exactly 1,890 people is the limit for them. And I'm like, that's nice. I like that there's a specific number for that. But if there's more than that number of humans in close proximity, it makes them feel weird. They don't like it. They leave. So they've spread their town out as it's had to get bigger, as more people are there, into sort of villages that are a few minutes away. So that, people are still close by, but there's not too many people in any one place to make the trolls uncomfortable. And this sort of links into things that Joshua has been saying since the very start of the book, where he talks about the silence with a capital S, which was such a Pratchett-y way to put that, and how he prefers it, that silence that he gets when he's on a world where there's nobody else. But it also seems to be a thing which is either natural to everyone or just natural steppers, that other people can sense if there are other human minds in the same world as them. Like Sally certainly has a feel for it. It's not clear if everyone does, but they also talk about the idea that maybe everybody does, but the thing is that humans are born into a world where there's already millions or billions of other humans, so you kind of have evolved to deal with it.
Yeah, there is no silence,
Trolls and elves, because they can step and they've always been able to, they have evolved to live only with a few thousand other people, and any more minds than that feels weird and gross and awful to them.
And Joshua was born into a world where he was literally the only person there, so he's got that affinity as well.
Yeah, he's got a bit of that.
And I wondered about like whether that was a reference to the evolutionary cycle of these creatures, the elves and the trolls, where at the start where it's sort of alluding, and I don't know if we ever got a concrete resolution one way or another, whether they originated on Earth and then there were too many humans and then they stepped away, right? It was their evolutionary mechanism to sort of defense mechanism to step, but we didn't develop it. So
yeah, I feel it fairly strongly they're not from the dead of Earth, but it's one of the reasons why they don't go there very often, or stay very long. But they have visited, which is where the stories of trolls and elves and other supernatural creatures come from. Which I thought was cool. And I thought that, the little touches, like the thing about the iron and the stone circles and the fact that, it matches up with the idea of the fairy ways and the other world in Celtic mythology, particularly, which Sally talks about because her grandfather on her mother's side was like a really strong natural stepper. And who could, as she eventually reveals, had the family knack for finding the soft ways or the soft places, which are places where you can step through multiple worlds in one go, and also which move you geographically, because one of the other plot points is that when you step, you don't move in space, you only move into the equivalent place in the next world along.
It's not a TARDIS.
Yeah, which is where a lot of the problems on Step Day came from, because kids were building a stepper box on the second floor bedroom of their house and flicking the switch and then falling to the ground because there was no house on the other world.
Yeah, we'll come back to that because that's a big plot point.
Yeah. So they're finding out all this stuff slowly. Sally's sort of slowly trusting them and revealing a bit more. And they decide to keep going because one of the other things they've noticed and one of the big mysteries is that the trolls and also the elves, who are another species of stepping hominids who are much smaller but very strong and very aggressive. And they have this amazing, there's a great sequence where they stop on a world, because this is earlier in the book, but Josh was like sick of being on the ship all the time. He wants to touch the earth. So he says, well, we've got to stop for an hour each day so I can go down on the ground and walk around. And then he says, can we stop for a whole day and check a place out? Because we never stop very long and we don't really get a good idea of what any of these places are like. We've been through millions of Earths and we haven't really seen much of any of them. And Lobsang stops him on a world on purpose where he gets hunted by a pack of these elves who are riding on the back of these giant pigs. It was very Princess Mononoke, giant boars sort of thing.
Was there 30 to 40 of them? Or
was there
30 to 40 of them?
Oh, like... don't.
30 to 50 wild elves, yeah.
Who had just left the yard.
But yeah, the way they're described when they're fighting, like they leap through the air and they step sideways and then step back. It reminded me of Nightcrawler from the X-Men.
Yeah, that's
and
a really
when
good...
you see him, like in that second X-Men film, but also in some of the comics where they really sort of go to town on, well, if you could just disappear and reappear somewhere else, how would that affect the way that you fight people? And this is not quite that, but it's very similar. And yeah, I just thought that was really cool.
It's a really good scene. Yeah, absolutely.
But it also makes them terrifying.
Yeah.
And it also ties in with some of the problems back on like our Earth, where people are using the stepping technology for assassinations and for terrorism, and they tap into that a few times. And so there's a police officer we haven't really talked about much.
Oh yeah, and she's one of my favorite characters.
What's her first name? Like I know her last name is Jansen.
Monica Jansen.
So she's like tapped into it all really well. Like she's the one who comes up with the idea of people sleeping in bunkers. Like if you dig out a bunker, it's hard to step into it because they'd have to dig a bunker in the equivalent next world before they can step into the same space in yours, and they'd also have to know about it. So that's very clever. Yeah, and they talk about all the different security measures that try and protect you from steppers coming into your house, and they're all very ineffective. So I kind of wanted to ask the two of you, how would you keep steppers out of your house if you couldn't build a bunker?
I'd be okay actually where I live, because I live in an apartment which is not on the ground floor. So unless someone built a platform that was quite tall on an adjacent Earth, and you would have to know if it was there, right? Because if you could step at any time, you just go downstairs, step over, and like, oh yeah, no one's built a platform, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, because you couldn't bring I guess you could bring a wooden ladder.
Yeah, are we talking about infinite resources here, Liz? Like, how much defensive budget do I have?
You have $10,000.
Okay, that's not enough to build an apartment building then. Okay.
We can come back to that. That's good. But yeah, I was like, how would I protect myself? I'm like, it's like when you think about the house you live in now, you go, oh, well, if someone really wanted to come in, they could.
They could, yeah.
But there's no reason for them to.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the same, kind of.
And it also changes the level of like theft in this world, right? Because nothing has that much value anymore. So stealing things is not as big a deal as, say, murder, because everybody still murders despite,
Yeah.
Well, you say that, but actually, and Monica's the character who thinks about this, she specifically says at one point, like, even the sort of non-material crimes are just not as common on other worlds because there's not that pressure of poverty and desperateness that drives a lot of crime on the Datamurth.
Again, the positivity of this book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things it did remind me of frequently is one of my favorite parallel universe things, which is the TV show Sliders, which was not always good, but it had some great episodes. And there's one, right at the end of the first season, there's one where they slide into a world where the population is just really low. So everybody lives really well. But there's a sinister sort of course, side to that, and which is hidden away. But they just talked about the fact that, there's like plenty of resources for everyone, and nobody has to live in poverty. And you're like, I'm sure it wouldn't be as simple as that. But you can see how that lack of stretched resources, I mean, but then, again, that also sort of abdicates responsibility here, because we do technically have plenty of resources for everyone who's currently on the planet. They're just not distributed equally.
Yeah, the book definitely sort of, I don't know about whether, I was about to say sidestep, but I stopped myself. But
Why?
did I? But I think it avoids the issues, and I don't know if this is deliberate or whether it's just the nature of the book and what it's talking about, but like we hardly have much of a conversation about sort of colonizing other worlds and the idea about that, or the philosophy behind that. And it's more focused on like the idea of traveling across great distances and the whole pioneer aspect, but not so much on the negative side of things, which I appreciated.
I kept waiting for them to like come into a world and be like taking over something, but that didn't really happen so much. But there is like an element like near the end, like the other big plot point where a lot of the species that have been able to step are fleeing from something. Yeah. And they haven't been able to figure out what that is until they get to this thing called the Gap. And they pass across it and they discover first person singular, which has been moving through worlds and just absorbing life.
She feels like a very Baxter-esque.
And she's a lady.
Creature.
Yeah. Well, I think we should explain the Gap a little bit more. So the Gap is a
really good clothing store. Oh, no, sorry.
But it's also a world where there is no Earth. Like, it's been destroyed by some sort of amazing cataclysm.
It's an excellent reveal.
So when they step into it, they're just in space, which is not much fun.
It's not ideal, no.
Yeah, the characters make it across the Gap. They meet this character, first person singular, who is the character from the start of the book, the whole ocean of microbes that become one giant sentient entity, which has created a sort of a bud of itself, or a part of itself that can step, and has sent it towards where it senses all the mines are, but it can't cross the Gap yet. Probably it will figure it out, because the characters figure it out. They sort of do a very quick step across it.
Yeah, double step it, yeah.
And the interesting thing about it is it's not malicious. Like, it doesn't feel like a malicious presence. It just is doing what it's doing naturally.
But do you feel... So this is the one part of the book where I was a bit like, really? Because I really enjoyed the character first person singular and the concept, but I just didn't feel like they sold it to me that it was a natural consequence of this organism, that it was going to envelop everything in it and eat it. Like, I felt like that needed a lot more justification and build-up, whereas they just kind of just tell you, no, that's how it is. Like, it wants to travel and meet other creatures. And then I think it's just like one paragraph where Lobsang says, and by necessity, that means it's going to turn all these other planets into its own planet and absorb all the life on them. And I'm like, does it mean that? Like, why?
Like, I would have liked more time to lead into that and to tease out that idea. I agree. Paragraph is not enough. It probably deserved several chapters of like gentle dotting that in until like a reveal, or that we come to the conclusion ourselves. But I do believe it as a concept, because it is something that's come up in other science fiction about like, wouldn't it be better if we were all one and safe and together? And it's like come up in a few ways of all like sentience like coming into one mass, like a hive mind kind of thing.
Hive mind, yeah.
Or all being uploaded to a central like hard drive kind of thing in an AI. Like, it's a concept that is quite common, arguably. And so I do believe it as a motivation for this first person singular, because it's like, oh yeah, well, I'm good and this is safe, and why wouldn't I want to bring other people or things into this world that we can all be one thing, happy, safe together? But it didn't get the airtime it needed.
I think it sort of just assumed the purpose of like the natural progression of an entity, right? Like humans want to survive, and that's our instinct. The first person singular's instinct is to do a specific thing. It reminded me a little bit of Stephen Baxter's Zealey series. So that series of books I mentioned at the start has some cool aliens, but one of the cool aliens are these creatures called these Photino birds. I think that's how you say it. And they're sort of dark matter entities that sort of envelop everything and sort of remove all carbon-based life. And the series revolves around both humans and aliens having to deal with this entity. So that sort of brought this creature to mind. So maybe I accepted it a little bit more, just because I know the surrounding material of one of the authors had written something similar.
And it's also like any colonizing force, I think, to a degree, thinks its way is best and that it's doing things for the greater good. And it is a colonizing force to a degree. And its net outcome might be horrifying for everyone, but it believes it's doing the right thing. I'm not saying that's a universal blanket rule for all colonizing forces, but I think it is a motivator that can be applied here.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, fair enough. And I did buy into it. I believed it, but I just sort of felt I was being asked to believe it rather than being shown it. You know, I was being told rather than being shown. I mean, because, when they meet first person singular, or rather the bit of her that is traveling through the various worlds, she does have like all these creatures, including elves and trolls, embedded in her. But the reason that they're running from her is not actually because she is going to destroy all life. They're running from her, they posit, because they can't stand the feel of too many human minds. But first person singular is a gestalt entity, like made up of all these little microbes, and has an enormous mind that must feel like thousands upon thousands of human minds to people who are sensitive to that. And that's why they're running away from it, because it's coming their way. Although how much they can sense that, because it doesn't seem like many trolls and elves cross the gap, because they probably don't really understand what the gap is, because they don't have that kind of technological culture to understand space.
I guess it depends on whether east and west connect up on the other side, and if you can come around from the other way, or if there's ends. Like, is it a circle, or is it...
Yeah, that question is posed a few times, yeah.
But there isn't an answer, so like you could potentially like never encounter the gap but go everywhere else if it's connected. If you started on one side of it and moved around the other way.
Yeah, that's a lot of stepping.
Yeah.
But it seems fairly clear that the natural steppers, like the elves and trolls, can step pretty quickly.
Step in time.
Or step lightly, which is the delightful phrase that Sally's grandfather uses.
Yeah,
I really like that.
Good.
And he talks about the fairy ways and stuff, and I'm like, look, I'm a sucker for Celtic mythology, so I was on board with all of that. That was great.
It puts on a whole new perspective for that Mary Poppins song, where all the chimney sweeps like do their step in time.
Yes. I think one of the things that makes this novel feel realistic, despite this obviously fantastical scenario, is partly the use of language, and that they don't invent weird new terms to talk about stepping too much. I mean, the long earth is an interesting term, and it kind of makes sense if you view it sort of as one continuum, and then it has like sort of one dimension because it just goes left and right. It doesn't go, like you were saying before, it doesn't also go north and south or in and out. Like, it doesn't have more than one dimension.
I don't like the imagery of it. Like, it bothers me. Like, I don't like this the long earth.
I struggled with that for the majority of the book because I kept thinking of Datameth as, not the long earth, and then everything other than that as the long earths.
Yeah, it is a bit difficult.
Yeah, the singular and plural sort of messed me around for a little bit, yeah.
I'd rather be like the infinite earths or something. But I think that's a bit obvious, but yeah.
Well, interestingly, the phrase "the long earth" doesn't appear in the original short story. I don't think they really use step either. I say they. Terry wrote it by himself, so I don't think he uses the term step. I think hop actually is the term he uses in the original story. But I thought step was good.
I would argue, though, that the title "The Long Earth" and even the concept of it put me off reading this because it just is not a compelling image, and it's vaguely uncomfortable. Like, it's not an exciting name. It's not something that would make me want to pick this up, and I don't think it expresses the concept of the book until you've read the book.
Yeah.
And I think a good title should do both. Like, it should entice you and be what the book is about without needing to know what the book is about. You should be able to take a decent stab. But if you can't take a decent stab at what the book's about, it should at least be interesting.
There's a reason why this is one of the books where the authors' names are much bigger on the cover than the actual title of the book.
Yep.
I'd pick up something called The Infinite Earths.
Yeah. I think it has more of a sci-fi connotation to me than the Long Earth, I think. Yeah.
Well, look, conversely, I want to go into bat for the name because I didn't find it as off-putting as the two of you, it seems. But it also feels a bit more like a down-to-earth thing. Like infinite, for one thing, they don't know that it's infinite. Like there might be a final Earth and there's no more after that. There's lots of them. We never go more in the book past about 2.5 million, which is heaps, but it's not infinity. And we don't know how far they go in the other eastways direction, because all of the travels that we go on in this book, pretty much, apart from a couple of Earths close to Madison, are all west.
It's interesting because they point out that, like, there's a character points out that Westerners go west and Easterners go east.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and I can kind of see that happening, like, psychologically.
It kind of makes sense. Yeah.
But it does mean that the stepper boxes must have specified which way around the switch is labelled, because otherwise people could label them wrong and they're like, I'm in the wrong place. But everyone has a consistent idea of which way is west and which way is east. So no one has decided it's the other way around.
Here's an interesting thing, and I'm curious to hear your opinions on the stepper box itself, because this book is set, what would we say, like 2015, right?
Is when Stepping Day was.
2015 to 2030.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of assumptions made at the start, which aren't wrong or incorrect. It's just interesting that a scientist releases this diagram, this thing on the internet. The majority of it is done by kids, and it's building this sort of craft box that people of a certain generation would assume to be more natural than, say, the current generation, if you get my meaning. So it's sort of it's an arts and crafty sort of thing that some people would be more, have an affinity to. So it was just an interesting thing that I think maybe the authors connected with more than perhaps the, children who would read this book.
Yeah, it's like them as children in 2015. Like,
exactly.
It's more something that my dad would have naturally done than me.
Yeah.
Well, it's something that I did. When I was a kid, it was still a thing that you did. You played with electronics, but you bought like an electronics kit and you gave you instructions and you built things. And it was a hobby thing, but it was also like a bit of a fad that any kid who was even vaguely a little bit into science would do. And it was a sort of thing that I think, 10, 20 years before I was a kid would probably have been a lot more common in some ways, because if you wanted a radio, you had to build one.
Exactly.
Right? A kit was way cheaper than building or buying a commercial one.
Well, I went through one of those old annuals that like Boys Own Annual for 1940 something a couple of years ago, and I was flicking through the ads, which were targeted at children because it was for like, I don't know, people like boys specifically between the ages of like 8 and 15. And they're like, oh, build this like radio thing. I'm like, how smart were kids back then? Like they're building stuff that could actually do things. Like, whereas I thought about what I did as a kid, and I'm like, I tried to make a dinosaur out of those wooden things that you like poke out of the pack, and my dad had to do most of it for me. And I was like, how did we get so? How did I specifically? Why was I such a dud kid when like kids in the 40s were building airplanes that were actually
they're
engines?
Geniuses, and I was breaking aircraft kits, and I broke more than I succeeded at them. So.
Well, look, I want to go on about for you two now, because you're not idiots.
You should.
It's not that hard to make electronic stuff if you've got all the gear.
Now this makes it worse, Ben. This isn't helping.
No, but I'm saying, like, you could have done it if that was the thing that you were doing when you were a kid, right? And people could do it now, but there's not much point because the way that capitalism has evolved is that making these things en masse makes them so cheap that you would just buy one instead of spending the hours required to build one of your own. Whereas that wasn't true 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? So in a similar way, it's interesting that the stepper box is a thing that you have to build yourself.
Yes.
And only the people who would build it themselves would learn to step. It's an interesting argument that on step day, it was all kids doing whereas I kind of feel like it would be all nerds. And it would be all tech nerds. And that worries me because if tech nerds led the...
looking at it.
No, but I think the thing that pushes it towards kids is the potato.
Oh, like, because any adult would look at it and go, that's dumb. It's got a potato in it.
I feel like it's kids because of the potato.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but it's like a potato battery. I guess, like, kids might get into it because of Portal. If you played the video game Portal 2, there's a main character that's like an evil computer, artificial intelligence. And at one point, she gets supplanted by another artificial intelligence and put into a tiny little computer, which is attached to a potato battery as its power source.
Oh, interesting.
Which is going to run out, and she's really angry about it. And of course, it's entirely unrealistic. Like, you couldn't run any complex kind of computer off a potato.
You need a lemon.
You need at least a lemon. That's right. Yeah. But look, we're kind of near the end of the main plot. We should probably finish that off so we can talk about all the other bits of stuff that happens. Because once they meet first person singular and discover that they're going to, she's going to keep moving, eventually she'll find a way past the gap and keep moving towards the Datum Earth and probably absorb everybody along the way, but then also absorb Datum Earth, and every human being will be part of her one giant organism, which is a very real threat to them. I didn't quite feel it, but apparently it was. But they realize that she's not evil. She is friendly, like you said. And that's their kind of one saving grace, is that if they can communicate with her, maybe they can persuade her not to do this. And Lobsang decides he's going to be the one to do it. So he puts his body, and we haven't talked about this actually.
Oh yeah, he's great.
Because he is like an artificial intelligent computer, right, that claims to be reincarnated human soul. But on the airship, he kind of inhabits the airship, which is one of the reasons why it can step, because
it is him.
It's his body, essentially, and it's not made of iron, it's made of some other sorts of materials. Every time they said that, by the way, like Jansen goes into the police department on one of the nearby stepwise Earths quite early in the book, and one of the police chiefs has got like a laptop, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure most laptops have got some iron in them in one way or another. Clearly there's a whole industry that's built on finding alternatives to iron for various things. But he's got all these different bodies, right, that he starts making.
And voices.
And voices, yeah, and he keeps tweaking it. Like he keeps going into the secret part of the airship where the others aren't allowed to go, behind the blue door. And there's a fabrication thing in there where he can make stuff, and he just keeps making himself new bodies.
Except a bullwhip. Couldn't do that.
Oh, that's such a... I love that. When we get to favourite bits, that was a great scene. I really enjoyed that.
It's so fascinating, like, because if you were a computer, though, or if you were a robot, as people, we wear clothes to express ourselves. If you could just fabricate entirely new everything all the time to express how you were feeling or how you wanted to present in a certain situation, like, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
If
a
you're
little
like,
bit.
I need to look a certain way for this meeting, and I need to look a certain way for this party.
Completely. Yeah.
I would do it a little bit, but I feel like my sense of self is very tied to what I look like. And like most people, there are things that I don't like about the way I look that I try to control by, haircuts and stuff.
Yeah.
But by and large, who I am is partly shaped by my physical presence.
I guess it depends on what you've got from the beginning, because, like, I agree. It's like, where is your sense of self tied to? If you have always had the ability to change how you look to suit the circumstances, like, I feel like I can't step out of my own brain for this. I would always want to look like me to a degree, like maybe just with different hair or different this. But maybe you would be like, I need something to show that it's me all the time. Maybe you choose a scar or like a certain feature, like you always are half this color and half another color, or something. You choose something unique.
You have a tell, like your eyes are always the same or something like that, which is a classic one from fantasy fiction.
Yeah, or like you have like a Bowie lightning bolt over your face all the time or something. There's like a unique flair that you have. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Lobsang's sense of self is so curious because he chooses to be a vending machine initially.
And I'm sure we'll get to this later, but the three characters on the ship four, I suppose. He often seems to be the most human of the characters, right? He expresses himself in ways that are much more obvious and much more like fallible, I guess, than the other two.
Yeah, and he's an interesting character in that he's got bits of other computer intelligences that you come across, but he also he feels very human for the most part. And I think some of my favorite parts of the book are where he does things and people kind of go, but you're a computer, why would you mistakenly get that word wrong or take a pause or have a puzzled look on your face? And it's never... is it calculated or is it natural?
Yeah.
Like that's the essential question about Lobsang. Is he really a reincarnated soul of a Tibetan motorcycle repairman?
And we keep coming back to that as well. Like, it's not something that's ever said, oh, yes, it is. Like, we all assume, and it is fairly obvious that he is an AI, but he has so many human qualities that it keeps asking that question.
I do keep imagining him as Michael Fassbender in the Alien movies, like the newer ones.
Yeah, the only good thing,
He had that sort of, Alien series, Android kind of vibe. Those characters who are mostly human, but there's something a bit off about them. Whereas he sort of mostly effortlessly is human except for his body, but then he sort of evolves his body to become more human-like as he goes along.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting. I also liked the fact that he's got this sort of immense power and he is distributed, and he admits that, yes, there's backups of me in various places, but really I only exist in one place, and he claims it's because he was human, and that singular locus of being somewhere is a habit he just can't break. Even though as an artificial intelligence, he could be looking out of 20 different cameras at once and be in 100,000 different places all simultaneously. He doesn't do that because that's not his experience. He's an entity that exists in a point in space. And so when he puts himself into this humanoid body that he's built, and he says, look, I'm going to go and get absorbed into first person singular and talk to her and learn everything I can and try and persuade her not to do the thing. It is a sacrifice. Like they're going to take his backup information back to Datum Earth, and he has already said at the start of the book that if anything happens to me, that's what I want you to do. There will be a backup of me that will absorb that information from the black box recordings essentially, and become a sort of new me, but it won't be me. It'll be like a new version of me. And you're like, oh, it's very sort of Thomas and Will Riker kind of territory, where they're both real people and they both have a claim to being that specific person, but they are different.
At one point, I was wondering if Lobsang was Douglas Black, like the main guy.
Who we never meet in this book.
Yeah,
No.
So I was like, ooh, are they the same person? To the point that I wrote out Douglas Black and Lobsang. I'm like, ooh, there's a lot of similar letters there, but not. So it's not an anagram, sadly, which I should have been able to tell by just looking. But yeah, and then I was like, maybe it's without the Doug, because it's Douglas. But then you end up with Lasbong, which is not great. So yeah.
I'm glad you tried that out, though.
You pull that to its inevitable conclusion.
I had to give it a red hot go, and it is not a cryptic crossword clue for him being the same as that.
Yeah.
Oh, and one more thing I wanted to point out. I was extraordinarily disappointed that in chapter 42 we got no answers to anything. Like, I was like, this is the perfect opportunity to reveal a bunch of stuff, because they do it around the edges, but not in that chapter.
Yeah.
That's true. It is kind of them moving on from one mystery
to the next,
another one.
Should we talk about the grim stuff?
No, we should get to the end, because it is quite abrupt. Like, I found the ending of this book quite abrupt.
Yeah.
I'm glad I knew that there were more books, and I wasn't reading this when it was published, waiting for the next one to come out. But yeah, they decide, okay, well, Lobsang's gone off inside first person singular. We've got to take what's left of his consciousness back in the Zeppelin, which is called the Mark Twain. I don't think we've mentioned that before, which is a nice name, and there's lots of little Mark Twain references as a result. We've got to go back, but how are we going to do that? Like, he was piloting the ship, which was what allowed it to step. We can't step the vehicle. But Josh was like, well, what if we just grab these ropes that we used to tow it around because its propellers were damaged, and we just step and drag it behind us? And if you use your ability to find the soft places, maybe we can get back to the Datum Earth pretty quickly. And that works, and it takes them maybe 3 or 4 jumps, and they get back to Happy Landings, where they have a bit more of a, what is going on here? Why is it so weird? And they sort of refer to it in a few different ways. Like, they talk about it has a bit of a Stepford Wives feel, where everybody's so nice to each other. And they decide that maybe it's because of the humans and trolls living together. Because the trolls also, they have this whole thing where they sing, but that becomes like this sort of information dispersal. They refer to it as Trollopedia or something, where they have a short song which is like 10 minutes long, and a long song which goes for like a week. But they're all able to glom onto it and accurately replicate it even over long distances, and it gets passed on so that quite quickly every troll knows what one troll knows. Continue traveling towards home, back to the Datum Earth, and they stop off at Reboot, where the Green family has made their home, and who they know about because they passed through and heard the radio broadcast of Helen Green's diary. And they're sort of like, oh, this is nice. They stay there for a bit. And they're like, she's like, where are you going? And they're like, oh, we're going back to Madison, Wisconsin on Datum Earth. It's going to be great. And she just kind of looks at them and is like, haven't you heard? Yeah. And then we get the chapter where we follow Jansen. She and the other officers respond to a bomb threat that someone has said, we've got a suitcase nuke in Madison and we're going to blow it up.
Because they've laid the groundwork for this earlier, because earlier she was at a rally of sorts by a guy called Brian Cowley, who's this charismatic voice for the phobics or the left behind. He's like, yeah, they can go off and do all their pioneer nonsense, but our taxes shouldn't be paying for that. Like, they're not, it's us versus them. And like, Neanderthals all got wiped out when people evolved, and we're not going to let that happen to us.
It's full on. It's very X-Men anti-mutant kind of senator speech.
Yeah, yes.
That's what it really kind of reminded me of.
Good reference.
Because he calls his group Humanity First, which also has real kind of
right-wing
family first / what Australia, like nasty connotations.
Yeah.
And in the audience is Rod Green, who we learned earlier was the son left behind by the Green family when they stepped across to reboot.
And it ends up being him who has delivered the nuke to the middle of town, although he's handed off to someone else who's hidden it, so he doesn't know exactly where it is. He just knows when it's going to go off. And Jansen sort of spots him and realizes he's probably involved, gets that information out of him, and then sends out the message to everyone, step sideways right now, because there's a bomb going to go off.
And help those who can't step as well. Like,
I thought that was a really important part of that. And it was nice to see that everybody did it. People were stepping across and then going back and taking their elderly relatives and people who didn't know how to step and people who couldn't step and taking them into Madison. And there's this great description of the scene where on Madison West 1, you see basically the city of Madison being recreated, but just as groups of people. So like there's all the medical staff and the patients from the hospital in one spot. There's all the university students in another spot. There's all the sort of business people in another spot. And then you get that horrifying bit right at the end as people realize this bomb is about to go off. I'm definitely going to die if I stay here. And people in high-rise buildings just stepping from the floor that they're on, because it's like, well, there's a chance I might survive the fall, but I'm not going to survive a nuclear bomb going off.
Do you think it's a deliberate September 11 image, or is it just now that's tied in the public consciousness to skyscrapers? And
I think a bit of both, maybe.
Yeah, I think it would be hard not to make that a deliberate thing, but it's also, it's its own spin on it because, it's awful, but it's also this weird sci-fi version of that.
Yeah.
But, the book's written, there's a motorcycle, but it's a nun, it's Sister Agnes. The book's written, 11 years after, so I don't think you could really avoid that.
And set in America, so.
Yeah. But they can't find the bomb, they can't stop it going off, and the city of Madison is completely destroyed by the bomb. And Joshua and Sally make it back there, where they immediately run into someone in a hazmat suit saying, hey, we're here to meet steppers. There are signs in the nearby Earths, but maybe you didn't see them. And they did see them, but they went straight past them. And they're like, you have to go back. And they go back, and they're just being told they have to go through decontamination when the person they're talking to gets a phone call and says, hey, wait, are you Joshua Valiente? This phone call's for you. And it's Lobsang. And that's where the book ends. And it just sort of ends quite suddenly, I thought.
It's very much set up for a series. Like, it's like a pilot episode, really.
Yeah. At least the last bit was. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when I first read the ending, I was a bit like, really?
Yeah.
That's where it's going to stop? But on reflection, I'm like, I'm kind of okay with it. Like, there was so much stuff in the book. Like, how much more did I want there to be?
Yeah, I was happy for it to end there. I would have liked more first-person singular earlier. Is my abrupt complaint.
Yeah, no, I go along.
There wasn't much of a denouement at the end of that. It felt like just it happened, the nuke went off, and then the book was over. Because I'm reading on a Kindle, I wasn't looking at the percentage at the bottom, so you can't tell, obviously. And then it ended, and then I was like, oh, 100%. There you go. So I had that same reaction, but a bit more abrupt, just because I just didn't know visually that it was going to end. Yeah.
It does make you want to read more straight away, though, doesn't it? Like, it would have been excruciating not having the other books available.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I really enjoyed this book.
Yeah.
That sounds like I don't enjoy the other ones. I enjoy them more thoroughly, but it's just such a different style, and it was compelling in a different way, and I really loved it.
Yeah, I'm on the same boat. I'm in the same boat. I was not sure what I would think of it. And when I started reading it, I was really like, oh, this feels really Pratchett-y. As it went on, it felt a bit less Pratchett-y, but never not like Pratchett to me. Although I guess we'll get back to that when we get to our questions. Yeah, I really dug it in a way that was different and I wasn't quite expecting. But I really dug it.
This one I wasn't looking forward to. I was like, ugh, I don't want to read a collaboration. But it's amazing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It was surprising because I like some sci-fi, specifically on that far future. When they say billions of years, that's where I tap in. But This one was a lot more optimistic, and Stephen Baxter's writing is usually quite far, far future. To see him pull it back to sort of near future, but still have plenty to work with, was surprising. And I really enjoyed it at the end, for sure.
It's like strange territory for both of them then. Like
Absolutely.
Not their comfort zone, which is kind of nice.
And I mean, it felt very contemporary. It didn't really feel like it was futuristic. And I feel like the only reason it's set a bit in the future is to give them an excuse to have the advanced computer and a robotic technology that is required to have the character of Lobsang. Although I also felt like you could have done that in the current day and just be like, this is all like secret technology that the rest of the world doesn't know exists, because that would be quite plausible. It's as plausible as it is that it happens in 10 years' time, you know.
I guess with a lot of like hard sci-fi and specific sci-fi, sort of softer in this case, I think I wouldn't consider this completely the Stephen Baxter central kind of writing, but it always depends on how much time it takes for a book to date. And, you know, this is a few years after it's written, but I think it holds up pretty well. And I think it would take a little bit of time for it to,
I'd agree. And look, I don't know how they were written. I don't know if they wrote them all at the same time, but they were certainly released a year after each other, all 5. So this one was in 2012. And so only the last 2 came out like the year of Pratchett's death and the year after. So I'm not sure if it was actually published before or after.
That was the last work he worked on, right?
I'm not sure about that. It would all depend on when they were writing it, I guess, because the Shepherd's Crown, which is the final Discworld book, that was published after his death, which was the year before the final Long Earth book.
Yeah.
And I don't know about your editions, but because mine's the paperback that would have been published around the same time as the hardcover of the next book. It's got a big ad in the inside back cover for the next book saying, hey, you should read the next book. And I'm like, I really want to, because what the hell happens next?
I'm kind of charmed at the back of it. They've got an author photo of them together. And I guess I just always assume that when people collaborate on a book, they're never in the same room, which is incredibly not the case. But it's just kind of nice. They had a joint author photo.
Yeah.
So before we get on to the listener questions, and there are lots of them, does anyone have any favourite bits or other observations they want to make in general about the book?
For once, I don't have a favourite bit, because it felt like this was moving so fast and so many things happened. It
very
was
frantic,
just non-stop things that I enjoyed. So I actually can't pick a favourite moment, which is strange for me. Though I did very much enjoy the glimpses into the nuns around him. Like, that was, I think, always like a nice sort of relief.
Anytime they turned up, it was great.
Yeah.
Look, I found a couple of passages that just felt so Pratchett-y to me that I really enjoyed. There's a bit sort of in the first quarter of the book or so when Joshua's heading off to meet with Lobsang and go off on their expedition in the Mark Twain Zeppelin, where he gets on a small private plane, and it describes this one sentence that I really liked, where it says, within, what wasn't upholstered was carpeted, and what wasn't upholstered or carpeted seemed to consist of the dazzling teeth of a young woman who, as he sat down, provided him with a Coke and a telephone. And you're like, this is weird. But it's the experience of the ultra-rich. They have their own planes and people who look after them. So I quite enjoyed that sentence.
It was a great voice from his perspective as well, right? Because you're imagining that that's exactly what he's thinking. Someone who's just been walking, you know, away from all this tech, and then now he's surrounded by it. The luxury.
Yeah. And there were lots of bits where I just saw lots of little bits of Pratchett coming out. I'm like, oh, that's a Pratchett idea. That's a Pratchett idea. That's clearly something he's reused from somewhere else. That reminds me of this. There were lots and lots of those. And I wondered, Joel, if you saw things like that were Baxter-y kind of bits.
The first-person singular was the thing that cemented the fact that Stephen Baxter worked on the book for me. Just like the aliens, the humanoid ones, didn't so much pull from him, I didn't think. I haven't read all of Baxter's works. I've only read selections. And yeah, I think probably the alien and the crunchy science talk, definitely, right? And there's a lot of it, but not as much as I expected. Again, we're moving away from Neil Stephenson and more towards Jules Verne, I think, which I enjoyed.
Yeah.
Oh, I did have a favourite line. It's when Monica is learning about the guy who made the diagram originally. And they talk about how neighbours saw him bringing a goat into his house. And she goes, a goat? Cue predictable banter between Clancy and the dispatcher. Maybe goats gave this guy the horn, etc., etc. Ha ha. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really funny. But also that's so much ruder than usual for Pratchett.
Yeah.
It's overt jokes.
Yeah, she's definitely got more on that side, like her conversation with the chief of police, I think it was, or the superintendent.
The rust
like,
bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of
That was great.
It was good.
We should read that line. That was really good. Yeah, when Jansen's talking to her chief, she makes a lot of fun of him for being like a dude, basically, a typical
the exotic dancer
man.
line as well.
Yeah, there's he says, it's starting to get more exotic. Oh, to hear you using that term without the word dancer attached to it. So was one of them. But then later on, when she's explaining that you can't take iron across, although rust can go across because it's bound up with oxygen molecules, he says, just tell it to me the way you understand it. The most basic problem, I mean, for Madison's finest, is that we can't carry through our pieces intact, right? Not even a Glock, no, because of the steel parts. No metallic iron can be carried over, sir, or steel. You can take through whatever you can carry, save for that. And then she says, why, rust can be carried over because that's a compound of iron with water and oxygen. You can't take your piece over, sir, except for all the rust on the shaft. He eyed her. That isn't some kind of lewd remark, is it, Jansen? Wouldn't dream of it, sir. Which I thought was great. I don't know why they sound like they're from Boston, but, it's the wrong part of the country. But yeah, there's lots of little bits like that are very funny.
I think one of the best bits for me was the friendship between Lobsang and Joshua. Was really cute, and especially the bit when they started dressing up and watching the movies, and when they dressed up and watched Blues Brothers. That made me laugh. That was great.
And him trying to convince him to get Sally on the ship, offer her sex.
Yeah. It's like, you don't know how relationships work, do you? Yeah, it's great.
And he's like, I've read all the books. I understand. And how do you think little Tibetans are made? that was very funny. I actually, on the movie thing, I was really getting to like Joshua. Like, I found him a bit sort of unlikable at the start, but then I started to get to really like him. And then about halfway through the book, there's a passage where Lobsang picks the movie of the night as Galaxy Quest, and he falls asleep while watching Galaxy Quest. And I was basically like, we can't be friends now, Joshua.
Yeah.
If you can't enjoy Galaxy Quest,
we're done. Yeah.
I am out. I'm done.
Is it a problem if I haven't seen Galaxy Quest, Ben?
Ooh.
No, if you haven't seen it, that's okay. But if you
haven't seen it,
and you don't think it's great, then we might have a problem.
All right. I'll put it on the list.
Although, just to be clear, we won't have a problem. It'll be okay. But it is very good. I think you'd enjoy it.
All right, I'll watch it.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if you didn't like it, Liz.
All right.
It was curious. There's a few pop culture references. There's also a very cute line from Lobsang when I think Sally mentions, it's like Star Trek, and he's like, what, the original series? Or like, it was... It's a very...
He's such a nerd.
Yeah, he's such a nerd. It's great.
It's great. Oh, and then there's the whole... We mentioned this earlier. The whole Indiana Lobsang and the Turing test of Sally business, which is how I mentioned it in my notes, where they're talking about going down to investigate this weird civilization, because along their travels they come across exactly one civilization or signs of one that seems like it's not some sort of version of humans, like, because all of the stepping trolls and elves, they seem to have come from that same lineage, but this is one other weird civilization that they don't really understand anything about. It's the only sign they've seen of another advanced, in inverted commas, technological civilization. And so when they're going down, have you got any weapons? And they talk about, he's got this weapon, he's got this one, I've got this like cool crossbow with all these different sort of darts. Like, and I can build what's the phrase? I can fabricate a small but very sneaky tank. So it's like, we don't need a tank, okay? We just need something small. And he says, you're right, we've got to prepare appropriately. Please hold. He stood and went behind his blue door. Joshua and Sally exchanged another glance. Then after a couple of minutes, the door opened and the ambulant unit walked back onto the deck, wearing a fedora hat and carrying a holstered revolver and, of course, a bullwhip. Sally stared. Well, Lobsang, you have now passed my personal Turing test. Oh, it's just so good. And I like, Joshua's like, how did you make a bullwhip in a minute? Like, you have to make the different bits and then braid it. And he goes, no, I had one on the ship.
Why would you have one on the ship? Yeah.
Oh, it was great. Well, look, we should probably get onto some questions because we got lots of them and they were really good.
All right. So the first question is from Melissa via Discord. In the long Earth, why do you suppose only a few people have the natural ability to step without the device, and would that number increase with successive generations?
Before we give our potential answers, I do know from another listener that this is something that's addressed in the later books, but I'm interested to know what you think, because I was kind of wondering about this myself while I was reading it.
There's natural variation of things, like there's just different levels of being able to do stuff. Like there's always like some people who can and who can't.
Yeah, natural variation.
Yeah, and I don't know if it would increase with generations, because if people weren't aware of it for the most part, they wouldn't... First of all, you wouldn't be able to keep track of it unless there was a DNA. I'm getting too deep. All right, someone else talk.
Crawl out.
Ah.
I think for me it was more like an imagination thing. I think I went definitely the like anti-science route on my theory crafting with it, where I was sort of like, well, if you're naturally a person who can imagine other worlds, you know, so someone who has the ability to do it without needing a device to tell you that you could, like people who are just naturally imaginative and, you know, the creative types, I guess, projection. But yeah, that was sort of my gist on it.
I
think the thing for me was the revelation later on that Sally's family were natural steppers, like it was following their family line, and that the implication was because all the other people that we hear about from history who've stepped, they all did it accidentally, and most of them couldn't do it again. Yeah, but her family are able to do it purposefully and without a stepper box, and it's not clear how
that happens,
how prevalent that is. But you know, that would, like the elves and trolls forming the basis for human legends about elves and trolls, probably, you know, people had been able to do that, and that's the source of stories about wizards and witches and so on. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I think the fact that at the end of it, it really becomes the lever that the bad guy, for want of a better term, pushes to form a wedge between people and cement his own power and push people to enact this tragedy in Madison is pretty significant.
Well, to jump off what you were saying, Ben, like it sounds like it's kind of like a nature versus nurture thing. Like Sally's family are all natural steppers with a few exceptions, like, or her father being an exception. He needs the box. But there could be lots of families like Sally's, it just doesn't occur to them that they can do it. Like they don't know that they can step and therefore they don't. But if one person in their family found out they could and could control it, they'd tell another person, and that's how it would, like the lineage of it would be. So it could be that most families are like Sally's, they just don't know it. And again, to bring it back to Harry Potter, to put both things together, more people could do it than they could expect, but there'd always be a population who couldn't, like Squibs, like Filch and all that. There's always like a small percentage who just cannot for whatever genetic reason. Yeah. So it's nature and nurture, but I do think that it would probably be a nurture thing.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it is implied that everybody can step, but that people's ability to do so varies, because, like we were saying before, even the phobics can be carried to another world, and it's arguable that they probably could step, but it just freaks them out so much, and that it has such an effect on them, because it's not just the ability to do it, it's also how it affects you, because the natural steppers don't feel ill, which is why they can do it so often, whereas people who need the box have that 10 to 15 minutes of horrendous nausea, which I, imagine is like a bit of sensory overload, as everything around you suddenly is at least subtly different to what it was a second ago. Yeah.
Would it be kind of like a more extreme version of being able to roll your R's? Some people, like pretty much most people can do it, but it wouldn't occur to you to do it if you weren't told to?
Yeah, I guess so. And again, it's also about nurture too, because if you grow up learning languages that don't involve those sounds.
Yep. Plus, I throw up for like 10 minutes afterwards now.
Oh, no.
I'm just kidding. I can't roll R's. So this is from Joel Molan via Discord. Have you read Baxter? And a follow-up, independent of the answer, do you believe you can tell what is Pratchett?
Now, a few people asked us variations on this question. I have read a tiny little bit of Baxter. In fact, I'm about halfway through his sequel to The War of the Worlds, which is called The Massacre of Mankind. But I don't feel like that's very indicative of his other writing, because I feel like he's really trying to emulate H.G. Wells' style. So I'm not familiar with his regular style. But you, as you've said already, Joel, you've read a few of his short stories in particular.
You hit it on the head there when he sort of does that with Arthur C. Clarke as well. So it's difficult to tell whether it's his style or he's writing this sequel. But some of his work, like I'm more familiar with the Zealey works. Maybe I can answer this in a different way, which is if you've written something, if you've co-authored something, if you've written something with someone else, at some point you forget who writes what. And it depends, on the type of collaboration that you're doing as well. But I got the sense during this that probably someone came up with the idea, and then someone edited the idea, and then somebody came back and did it again. So there's a level of you can't really tell. And there's certain ideas that you could say like, oh, that seems like a very Pratchett idea, which I think comes more from you two rather than me. So my take on it is like, oh, this seems like a very Baxter alien, right? But for the majority, I felt like it was one of those collaborations where the two complemented each other really well, that it was layered rather than very clearly this chapter was written by someone and this wasn't. So, yeah, complicated answer.
I actually haven't read any Baxter. I think I really will now because I really enjoyed this book. And it wasn't a deliberate avoiding, I just hadn't got to his work. As to whether or not I could tell the differences, every so often there'd be a line I'm like, that feels very Terry Pratchett. I couldn't... But it was strange because it didn't feel like a Terry Pratchett book throughout. It felt like thematically, yes, but words-wise, not so much. It was like a book from the mind of Terry Pratchett, dotted with the feeling of him as well, like an essence of Pratchett throughout. So like I said at the beginning of the podcast, if you gave me this with no knowledge of who the authors were, I'm not sure I would have guessed Terry Pratchett as one of them, because it's very plausible that other authors would be inspired by his work and would put Pratchettisms in, and that's kind of what it almost feels like there's Pratchettisms, not a Pratchett book.
Yeah, and I sort of felt that with Baxter. There are moments of him, but I wouldn't have said he wrote the book. Yeah.
For me, it reminded me very strongly of really early Pratchett. And I think like Good Omens, which feels to me like a very Pratchett-y book with these sort of Gaiman bits and overtones, for me it felt like a very early Pratchett-y book with, this other influence on it. But it still felt a lot more like Strata or The Dark Side of the Sun than anything else that I've read. And that's partly because there are so many ideas that crop up. Like, whenever they come across a really strange world that doesn't seem like the ones either side of it, they refer to it as a joker. And that's very much reusing a term from The Dark Side of the Sun, his first novel, his first sci-fi novel. And, as someone who probably liked that book a bit more than most, I really enjoyed that. It felt like Pratchett going back to these early ideas. And I think that's probably exactly what was going on, because he is going back to the source of this short story that he wrote around that time in the mid-'80s and using that as the inspiration for this. So, yeah, I felt the whole thing felt very Pratchett-y to me, but not Discworld Pratchett-y, more early Pratchett.
It's interesting that, and also Joel saying it doesn't feel particularly Baxter, because I was wondering if it was like a Baxter-dominated book, and if that is not the case, I feel like it's a very good collaboration then, because...
Yeah. I got that
they balance each other out.
Yeah, it felt very seamless to me. It never felt like there were bits that were vastly different in tone to other bits, and I thought it was really good collaboration on that score, for sure.
So I agree with Good Omens. It feels more Pratchett-y than Gaiman-y, and that is certainly not a complaint. I love Good Omens, but that to me feels like a Pratchett-dominated book in the best of ways. This seems different than based on our collaborative information.
It's curious because I've heard about this book before, and what I had heard was, this feels like a very Baxter book. But it usually came from people that read a lot of Pratchett and not a lot of Baxter. So it was based off that assumption that, it must be a lot like Baxter. Whereas when I came to it, I felt like, no, I can't pick it. I wouldn't say one over the other. Yeah.
It's a united voice, which is kind of cool. Like, and the early Pratchett voice as well, which is not one that we get to hear. So it's, Yeah. It sounds like it's a successful collaboration.
I think so. And I think for me, Joel, it makes me want to read some Baxter, and I would love for you to recommend some of his short stories, perhaps near the end, so that people can get an idea of his work without having to go and read a whole novel.
Absolutely.
Despite Joel's confidence, we absolutely forgot to do this. He mentioned the short story The Raft, and off-air recommended that as a good starter. It was later turned into a novel by the same name. We'll also try and get some recommendations online and put them in the show notes.
So next question, there's two from Belinda via email. Did you think the humanoids, I think those are more relevant to the second book, were a metaphor for something in real life, or just Baxter's love of humanoid creatures? And the other question is, would you leave home Earth? Like, would you be one of the first to go, or wait and see? Which way would you go, and what kind of potato would you use?
That last part, that's the killer question for me. What kind of potato? That's a good question. Joel, you said that you felt first-person singular was the most Baxter alien, but are there a lot of humanoid aliens in his work?
Well, from what I've read, and again, that it's just from a limited selection, I connected more with the aliens because they were so different, and I didn't find a lot of humanoids. That doesn't mean that he hasn't. So yeah, I couldn't speak to that, I don't think.
Do you think they're a metaphor for something?
I didn't get that feeling in this book. I couldn't pick it, but again, if I would read the series, maybe I'd have a better grasp on it.
So would we leave home Earth? Would we go first? Like, when would we go, and a potato?
I would totally go, but I would come back. Like, I would not go and live there forever. I would want to go and see it, and I would probably go quite far if I knew what I was going to see. Like, if someone said, hey, there's this Earth, it's like 2,400 steps away, and there's these things that look like dinosaurs, I'd be like, I'm going. I want to see them.
You're a
but
tourist
then I'll come
stepper.
home afterwards. Yeah, totally a tourist stepper. Like, I want to go and experience that. And I might stay there for a while because I don't often go on holiday to other places, but when I do, I like to go and stay for a while. So I really identified with that attitude from Sally and from Joshua in the book. Like, I'm not the sort of person who wants to go on a holiday and spend like 2 days in this place and 2 days in that place and 1 day in that place. I'd much rather spend like a week or a month in one city and get a real feel for what it's like and explore it. And I think that's what I would do if I was going through the long earth. Is I would go to a specific place because it sounded great and come home. But I think also I'd just visit the park in the earth next door, you know?
Yeah.
How about you?
I feel like this is a very a writerly response, and I don't mean it to be, but I feel like it would be a great writer's residency tool for free, where I would just pack up a suitcase, I would go a bunch away from people, and I would go to probably the exact place I would want to, have a residency here on Earth, right? So I'd like go to New Zealand, and then I would step, and then go to like an older, more tropical, temperate rainforest version of New Zealand, and build a shack.
Get eaten by a mower.
And be productive. And get eaten by a mower, yeah.
My natural instinct is to wait and see, but definitely go. However, I feel like if this did happen, you would be constantly aware of, this is changing human history in a big way.
Yeah.
It's not as though they suddenly revealed, we can teleport now. That's something I'd wait and see like 20 years before trying. Whereas this, I'm like, society's going to readjust around all of this, so you might want to be more immediate about things. Yeah.
Do you think you'd get, and this is a tangent to the question, but do you think you'd get really annoying people with this stepping where it's like, I heard that Sally stepped 3,000 steps away. And it's like, well, I heard, oh man, that would.
Yeah, you absolutely would.
Yeah.
The stories and the legends and the songs, like the memes that would happen immediately.
Absolutely.
Oh, man.
The insufferable, like, Logan Paul kind of YouTubers that would crop up, like, stepping across different things.
Prank stepping.
They even sort of, oh my God, prank stepping. That would be such a thing.
As to what kind of potato I would use, I'm real bad at knowing the different kinds of potatoes.
Yeah, I started reading about them once and I got really stressed out because there's like special ones you're supposed to have for mashing and others for pies and stuff. I was like, I just the ones that have the dirt on them are 50 cents cheaper per kilo, so I will buy those.
Yeah, and they taste better too.
Yeah.
Sebago is a potato, correct? I don't know.
It's like Dutch Royale or Cream Royale, or maybe they're both potatoes, but that's just because I can name those.
What about how you cook a potato? How's that? What type of cooked potato would you take?
I like a good mash.
Yeah.
But I also like chips. And I also, look, I'm Irish. I'll eat potatoes any which way, as much as that is in some ways a betrayal of my Irish heritage. But it's also tapping into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I love potatoes and I will eat them any which way.
I'd go wedges.
I am a big fan of the mash.
Yeah. Multiple wedges, in a stepper box, for sure.
Mash is good. Like you can plug it in different ways as well.
True.
But...
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. This is from Nell via Facebook. What do you think they were on when they thought of this book? Serious question, because Flail's Hands, who could think of Flail's Hands and more of these? I mean, it kind of reminds me a bit of the Chrestomancy series by Dynamo and Jones, but more grown up. I agree with the Dynamo and Jones thing. In terms of the coming up with it seems pretty normal sci-fi to me. But maybe that's because I've read a lot of this kind of sci-fi.
Agreed, yeah.
I think the biggest thing about it, we kind of touched on this earlier, is that it comes at the whole idea of parallel universes from a kind of a sideways
without humans
perspective. Because it's not about, like you were saying, the differences in history or encountering a version of yourself who's made different choices. It's kind of mostly about, as somebody says, it's like trying to run a galactic empire, but it's just all the planets are Earth. And you're like, that's kind of what it's like. It's if you could instantly travel to other planets, it would be much the same. But there's this interesting thing of making it much more practical and kind of believable for people to just step sideways into another planet and it coexisting with our planet in ways that makes the political dimension of it quite different to going to other planets. So
yeah,
I think it's really smart.
I think the exploration of it is probably where the creativity comes from rather than the concept itself. Like, I guess all stories, but science fiction specifically is a what if question, right? So if we're saying that what if there were parallel worlds, but in this case there's a but, and the but is but there were no humans on any other of them. So, like, that's the bit where it sort of gets a bit different. And then the exploration of that is where all that really interesting stuff of this book, for me anyway, came out of. So, yeah, and the main plot line, like you said, is a pretty standard Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues in the Air between worlds. So, yeah.
It's a bit like Off on a Comet, you know, where the ship is sailing in the sea and a comet smashes into the Earth and carries this bit of sea and the ship away with it. They're trying to explore the comet and there's all weird stuff there, which is another Jules Verne story. It is that kind of exploration of a weird place, traveling story. Yeah.
Yeah, but I really like this comment about the Chrestomancy series because that is Diana Wynne Jones, as we mentioned earlier, is someone who's come up a lot for me when I thought about this book, because the Chrestomancy series, for those who don't know, is about Christopher Chant, a nine-lifed enchanter who is tasked with keeping magic under control in all the alternate worlds. And I can't remember exactly. I think there's 12 different alternate realities, but they also all have branches. So it's like A, B, C, D, and so he's got all these lives because he was only born in one of them. And so he has all of the lives of his unborn selves, and that's why he's like the most powerful enchanter of these. I'm getting the numbers wrong. I haven't read them for a long time.
It's okay. It's like The One, that Jet Li film that you mentioned in our last episode.
Yeah. Except he doesn't have to go around killing his other selves to get all the power. But it is a lot like that. And she also has another a book like this called The Homeward Bounders, which is about a group of kids essentially who are homeward bound. They find themselves traveling throughout, and there's a whole Dungeons and Dragons game happening, and they encounter monsters, and they're traveling through these different things. And if I say any more, it's spoilers, but it's something that Diana Wynne Jones did seem to be very interested in and explored in a few of her books. Yeah, it's a good comparison. All right, shall we do another question?
This one's from James Beggs, also via Facebook, who asked, is Lobsang evil, or is he genuine in his love for and need of Joshua, despite hiding a lot of his agenda from Joshua? I think that's a fair question, because there are moments in the book, particularly towards the end, where Lobsang reveals, I knew this about you and I knew it would come in handy, I just didn't know why. And you're like, whoa, dude. And he often, particularly at the start, doesn't say things to Joshua, doesn't give him all the information and puts him in these dangerous situations. And Joshua says, we've got to work on our communication skills. And so do you think he's cold and calculating, or do you think he's just sort of learning how to be more human in his new form?
So I have a complex answer to this. First of all, I don't think it's as clear cut. I don't think he's either evil or genuine. He could just swing between the two or be a bit of each. Like, he is a bit cold in things, and I think he wants to have answers above all else. So he probably would, at least in the earlier stages, have sacrificed Joshua to the greater good of scientific discovery. But also he wouldn't want to get rid of an asset that valuable. So it's hard to tell whether it's genuine affection or genuine need for his skills and company. Second part is, are we only asking this of Lobsang because he's an AI? Because I don't think humans are as clear-cut either. Because, like, is Joshua good? Is Sally good? Like, you could ask this of any of the characters and come up with equally complex answers. But I do think it is an interesting one to interrogate. And I don't think there is a correct answer here.
Yeah. Anything with AI is always complex because we have to define whether we're talking about them in relation to human morality. Are we talking about morality as a concept? Are we talking about evil and good being binary value? This is so much. It's like a whole nother AI podcast conversation. But like, if we're talking about him as a character, do you guys think that Lobsang changes from the start of the book to the end of the book? Does he start off being a lot more calculating and end up being a bit more altruistic? Do we see a character progression there?
I think we see him grow affection for Joshua. Because originally Joshua was a means to an end, and he starts to like him and they're friends. And it's like, there's people whose morals will change. Like, oh, well, this for everyone, but not my friends. I'll look after them. They'll be exempt from the thing. So I'm not saying his thing is bad, but I'm saying that he grew affection for Joshua and would treat him differently as a result.
Yeah, I didn't find him particularly different at the end of the book, except in the way his relationships had changed, particularly with Joshua, but also with Sally a bit. Like, he seemed to genuinely like them. But then again, he seemed to genuinely like Joshua the moment he met him. He just didn't have much of a relationship with him because they hadn't spent any time together. But to address something you said, Liz, I think the reason we ask this of Lobsang is the character with all the power in the novel. Like, he's got immense resources, he's got immense technology, he's got immense personal power. He's not immortal, but he's certainly a lot more durable and has a lot more physical power and all these things at his disposal than any of the human characters. So it's natural to sort of ask, how is this guy using this stuff? Like, what is he doing with it? So yeah, I think that's why we ask that of him. But also, there is that tradition of AIs being a bit sinister and evil. Yeah.
So this one is from Zoe via Discord. The characters in The Long Earth, being a collaboration, are different from the ones we've seen in solo Pratchett books before. That said, do you see any threads that tie the two main Long Earth characters to any solo Pratchett characters?
So I guess you're talking about Joshua and Lobsang or Sally?
I reckon Sally, but Lobsang is interesting.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's definitely shades of some of his other robot characters in Lobsang. Again, I'm thinking mostly the Dark Side of the Sun.
Yes.
You've got the First Bank of Sirius, and you've got the robot character
MVP.
Isaac. Yeah, who both have that sort of sass, and they're very aware of their own nature, but they're also like, just deal with it because I'm here and I'm getting on with things. I felt like there was definitely some of their DNA in Lobsang, so I would link Lobsang back to them. What do you think about Joshua?
I feel like there's elements of a lot of them there, but not overtly enough that I would be like, oh yeah, no, he's Mort or he's this. Like, I feel like there's just, like, he feels like his own thing to me.
He also felt much more real. Like, I think in the Discworld books, a lot of the characters, while they do often feel like real people, they have intersections with real people, they also fulfill fantasy archetypes or sort of niches in the fantasy world that lends them a little bit of caricature. You know, like someone like Nobby Nobbs or Sergeant Colin or even Sam Vimes to a degree are fulfilling these kind of archetypal roles and have these stereotypical characteristics that even though they're rooted in reality, they take them sort of a bit far, and you wouldn't expect to meet someone like that in real life. Whereas these characters feel like they could be very rooted in the real world, particularly Joshua and Sally. Less so Lobsang, obviously, for a lot of reasons. But yeah, Joshua and Sally, apart from the bits of them that obviously come from the fantastical parts of their nature, I thought they felt like really real people. But I might take us into the next question, because it is kind of related, which was from Molokov on the Discord. He said, why do you think Terry loves the name Lobsang so much? And I've done some research, so I think I can answer this question, because Lobsang was the name of a real person. Sort of. So, as Discworld readers might know, and we've only sort of brushed up against one of them, there are two major characters in the Discworld named Lobsang, one of whom will show up in a book we haven't read yet. The other one is one of the history monks. But there was a book published in 1956 called The Third Eye, which was all about paranormal and occult stuff and had a lot of kind of Tibetan-inspired, if not actual Tibetan, mysticism in it. And it was supposedly written by Lobsang Rampa. And this was a hugely successful book. But it was reported afterwards that actually the guy who wrote the book was a plumber from Devon named Cyril Henry Hoskin, who claimed that his body hosted the spirit of a Tibetan Lama going by the name of Tuesday Lobsang Rampa.
Right.
So I feel like this book is really the source. It has to be the origin of why Pratchett likes the name, and it's clearly an inspiration for even the character of Lobsang in this book. I mean, he went on to be immensely popular. Like, he wrote something like 20 books, and they were about all kinds of things, including one, Liz, I found this when I was reading up about him. He wrote a book called Living with the Lama, which he claimed was dictated to him by his cat.
Oh, wow.
So you can probably still find these books, you know. So I think this is why he loves the name Lobsang, and I can just see that being such a Pratchett-y thing that he would have read that book in the 60s and gone, this is nonsense, but I love it.
Yeah.
I love it, and I haven't even read them yet. So,
yeah, that sounds great.
So yeah, I think that would be the definite answer to that question.
Yeah, I feel like that's thoroughly covered it. Also, I was going to say, it also sounds nice. Like, it feels nice to say.
It is, yeah. It is a good
name.
name.
Mouthfeel.
It does. Yeah. It does. I have no idea how authentic a Tibetan name it is.
I'll look that up later.
Yeah.
Next question is from Aaron Dick via Facebook. How much influence of other robot minds like this do you see? I remember thinking of Susan Calvin, Marvin from Hitchhikers, and the robot horse from Dark Side of the Sun. So that does tie back into Kosoi's question about influence.
It's interesting that he mentions the robot horse from Dark Side of the Sun, but not Isaac, who I thought was much more Lobsang-like. But I guess the horse did also have that kind of sass. I think they're all in there. I think Lobsang's got a lot of influences. What do you think?
I feel like there's perhaps like a really narrow window of how we can portray robots generally in this context, which sounds like a strange thing to say because like you could say the same thing about people, but not really. There's a certain way we imagine AI, and I do feel like this pushes against the boundaries of it in different ways because it is so much more human. But there are sort of like lovable goofballs who do human things, and we love that. Is kind of a theme for robot companions in this way, like because there's the sinister ones who are plotting to kill you, and then there's the fun sidekicks.
Yeah, AI is weird because like you have to sort of personify them in some way. And I suppose the most natural ways to think of them is distant overlords, and then like if you just humanize them, then they basically become no different to a human. And then at what point do you say where does their alien nature come from? I guess
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at that point, the story becomes usually about, are they
Yeah.
humans or not? Like, Blade Runner,
Yeah.
for example. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Questionable Content, the comic that's been running for like years and years and years, and that's full of AI characters. They're actually all very varied, but again, it comes back to how human are they? I don't know if we could imagine what an AI would actually be like without looking through the lens of humanity, because that's our boundary. That's like our cement walls.
I think that's true of all life. One of the things that I felt was an influence on Pratchett writing this was the writings of Jack and Ian, who he co-wrote the Science of Discworld books with, but who also wrote their own book called like What Would a Martian Look Like, which isn't actually about what would a Martian look like. It's about what would life be like elsewhere.
Yeah.
The whole point of the book is that we have this difficulty in imagining life that's not like life that we're familiar with. And you see this on so many levels. Like, one of the reasons why we get so sad when our pets die is because we don't know how to relate to another living thing except by imagining that they are like us, that they are like a human being. So, when you have a pet cat or a pet dog, we're always attributing to them human-style emotions. And I think we all understand on some level that whatever emotional life dogs and cats have, it's very different to the life that humans have, but we can't understand that. So we think of them as being happy or sad or loving or all those things that, they would have an equivalent of, but it's not the same. But we don't know how to understand that. So we interpret it as the human version of those things. And I think it's the same when we try to imagine aliens.
Yeah.
And robots, they're so often just like us until, and this is something I thought of when you're talking about questionable content, the robots or AIs in that comic are very much just like people until you brush up against the bits of their existence that are different to us. And then you start to go, oh, wait, I've never really thought about this. You just seem like a regular person, but now I realize you could just have a whole different body tomorrow. Or you can't really die. Or your existence is predicated on this technology. And all these things that are like, oh, this is
a
weird.
bunch of your friends that you grew up with do not have a humanoid body. They're like machines and running like systems and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And coming on from what you were saying before, the thing I used to say at school, because I was a real obnoxious kid, when people would ask questions and things, was because you'd talk about stuff like aliens and stuff.
Can relate,
and people would be like, oh, what would you do if you saw an alien? And my answer used to be like, well, I don't think we'd definitely know if you saw an alien. It could be huge, it could be tiny, you wouldn't recognize it as an alien or as a living thing. So we could be seeing aliens right now and not actually be aware of it.
Yeah.
Just because it's staring you in the face doesn't mean it's staring you in the face.
Yeah.
I guess this comes back to the whole like alien thing that we were talking about before, but imagining like, and this is the thing people always say, it's like, what if it, are there aliens out there? Maybe. What would they look like if they'd come here? You couldn't imagine it because, there's a thing that people always talk about when they theorize about this, the Kardashev scale, I think it is, where it's like, it imagines a civilization capable of doing that thing. We can't wrap our minds around non-material existence. Like carbon-based life forms and stuff like that. So you have to personify them in weird alien bodies with huge heads and bug eyes, like, because you can't imagine what true alien life could be like.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why we really enjoy stuff. And it sounds like this is the kind of thing you like about the Baxter short stories you've read.
Yeah.
Where someone makes an effort to embody those aliens in a way that then they think about how would that affect their culture and their mindset and the way they think and the way they live, and present them as being very different for us rather than, oh, they're just like humans but a bit culturally different.
Yeah.
Like, no, they're vastly different. Yeah.
So next question comes from Steve Leahy via Twitter. How does it compare to Andre Norton's take on parallel worlds, e.g. the Crossroads of Time or Stargate, or Neil himself in Reaver's Interworld? So I don't know any of those, so I can't really answer that. Is Stargate like the Stargate from TV, or is it a different?
Oh, is it the movie?
Oh yeah,
No,
I've seen the movies. I'm all across Stargate.
Yeah.
And I did think about Stargate quite a lot as well in this, because they do present all the different things that would happen if humans found out, like at large, that you could do this stuff. But yeah, I can't answer the rest of that question.
Neither can I. Yep.
Yeah, I haven't read those two. There was one other question, and I don't think we've got time to go into some of their questions, but Andrew Butchart on Facebook mentioned Nine Princes in Amber, which I have read. But I think that's not a very good analog, because that's it's a much more a fantasy book. People who can step to any version of the universe that they can imagine. And that's literally any version at all. But I think this is such a definitive, there are these worlds, And at one point, I mean, in the book, they talk about the fact that it seems like the difference between worlds that are next to each other is about 50 years' time of when they diverged, which is why all the ones close to each other are very similar. But like if you step 1,000 times, that's like 50,000 years of history that's different. Well, then there's got a much bigger opportunity to be weird and different to the other worlds.
And they even ask questions like, which version of Earth has a livable Mars on it?
Yeah.
And that's some mind-bending stuff to think about.
Which is clearly going to be explored because one of the later sequels is called The Long Mars.
Oh, there you go.
So, spoiler alert from the title. But they kind of do touch on that in this book, so I don't think it's really a spoiler to know that they go there. I don't know. I feel like, and I mentioned this before, I feel like it's very different to other explorations of parallel universes and alternate dimensions because it's not about the things that those stories are normally about.
All right, final 2 questions. This one's from Felix Trench via Twitter. Long Earth books feel very quiet and meditative to me. Do you think there's a deliberate tonal shift, or is it a result of what happens when you blend these particular 2 writers? And I think we've touched on this a little bit. Like it's kind of like a weird, like
it's a bit of the latter
merging.
Yeah.
The quiet and meditative thing I think is interesting because there are parts of it that feel that way. But also, I like your sort of analogy, Joel, that it does feel like an early science fiction novel. There is that sense of we're going to explore and the exploration is the point of the book, not the drama that happens along the way.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of early sci-fi, like Wells and Verne particularly. But I often say that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you should always read an abridged version because the full version is mostly just lists of fish that the characters see out the window of the Nautilus. And that's fascinating if, you don't have the internet or nature documentaries.
Yes, you read
but to just read the lists of fish with brief descriptions is not that exciting as a book. But this sort of, I think, is like a modern take on that, where there is a story, there are characters, the relationships between them are important, there's a central mystery, there's a lot of intrigue and weirdness going on, but it is essentially a kind of a travelogue. It's kind of amazing.
It's kind of interesting you mentioned that because I feel like a lot of hard sci-fi and some just soft sci-fi, I guess, tends to be very expositional and really go into the world building to the nth degree, where it bogs down the story. Like famously, Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park, right? Very different in the movie. And if you read it, it's just Michael Crichton being mad on science. Like there's whole pages of him losing it over chaos theory. And all of that stuff is sort of pared back here, where you still get a central narrative it's pretty clippy. The book is really quick. You fly through the pages. You don't linger long. So it negates the problems that happen in hard sci-fi, which might detract people from reading it.
All right, so last question is from A.E. Edmonds via Discord. If you could step, would you explore or colonize or just visit? As someone who's interested in nature, I was intrigued by the different evolutionary possibilities, the exotic biologies. The bird-watching opportunities would be endless.
That's true.
It's so true, and what a good note to end on as well, because because they do touch on the different evolutionary elements in the book.
I sort of partially answered this already with the earlier question, but I wouldn't explore or colonize. I would just visit.
Yep.
But the possibilities for studying evolutionary biology are incredible, because you can see all these forms of life that have evolved from what you could determine were similar ancestors. And there's various parts in the book where they do that. And they find like the weirdest things. Like, there's that great sequence we didn't mention with the ostrich that can fire cannonballs because it's got this second stomach that kind of ferments stuff into this solid ball that it can somehow expel. I mean, just some awesome stuff. And the flying octopus things in one of the forests, which just get like one line throwaway, and then someone goes, "How did they get in there?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I want to know. I want to meet those guys."
Side plot.
And we didn't really talk about it much, but there's that whole civilization of like dinosaur descendants.
The croc people.
Yeah, they've had like an advanced civilization and the only other technological civilization on any of the long Earths, and then they've been wiped out. Wait, what was their deal? Who were these people? Like they had rings and stuff that they take off their bodies, and they had a big nuclear pile in a big box, which reminded me of that 99% Invisible episode where they talk about the problem of communicating to future generations, hey, don't go near this nuclear waste, it's still dangerous. Which is a fascinating topical in its own. But I would want to go and see the weird biological possibilities and some strange birds for sure.
Preferably not crocodiles though, because they seem like terrible on every world. They're just the worst.
I think I would probably intend to come back to Earth, but I'd get all my affairs settled. Like I would probably like put my stuff in storage or like get out of any rents or whatever if I needed to, so that if something really interesting and once in a lifetime came up while I was away, I could stay for as long as I needed to. So always have the intention of coming back, but be ready to not come back if necessary.
Okay. Those are some great questions. Thank you to everyone.
Yeah, those are great
questions.
Yeah.
I couldn't quite get to all of them, but they were all great.
Yeah.
So thank you. Joel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great.
It's good to have you back.
Do you think you're going to read the rest of the Long Earth
I
books?
might, yeah. I picked up the audiobook after I read the book, and I started listening to it. It's good. The narrator's great, and yeah, I might just keep going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I might do the same thing, actually.
We are going to read every book for the podcast. So we will come back to this series, and we will find out what happens next in the Long War. I don't know if I'll wait until we get to the episode, because I kind of want to know.
Yeah, I need to know.
Joel, if people want to find you online and hear or read some more of your work, where can they find you and what have you been up to recently?
I have been in isolation, as most people have been. That's not too bad for writing, but it's strange. I'm one of those people that has actually been incredibly unproductive with my own writing, and isolation is just a weird time. But if you do want to find me on Twitter, you can find me at the Pen of Joel. I haven't tweeted since all of this started, I think. I just, stay off. I think I've deleted Twitter off my phone, so it's probably a bad place to catch me.
But if they want to find your podcast, The Morning Bell...
That's true, The Morning Bell...
is on hiatus at the moment, but it will be coming back.
It is coming back, and we're looking forward to getting some excellent people back on. It's themorningbell.com.au. There's plenty of back catalogue for you to go through. If you want to read my stuff, I have a short story out by a US short story anthology. It was called Strange Stories, Volume 1, published by 42 Books. It's a sword and sorcery time travel book, a short story rather, and I had a good amount of fun writing it. So if you read it, let me know. Tell me if you hated it.
No one's going to do that.
Can I tell you if I liked it? I mean,
no, don't tell me if you liked it, because I wouldn't
me.
believe you. Yeah, it's just how the writing brain works.
Come on. All right. Well, look, thank you so much once again for joining us. And thank you for listening, because there's no point in us doing it unless you are. So thank you so much for subscribing, for listening to Pratchett, and to our supporters. Thank you so much. You keep us going. You make sure we can keep making the podcast the way we want to, and that it is a sustainable enterprise, which means we can get to the end and read and discuss every single Terry Pratchett book. And I'm thinking, Liz, maybe the short stories, like having read the High Megas, I'm like, there's some cool stuff in his short story catalogue. I think we need to think about how we're going to cover more of the shorts, because they're real good.
Yeah, we'll find a way to do it, whether it's an isolation way or an in-person way. So it'll be good.
We'll find a way. Now, next episode, we've decided we're going to skip a little bit ahead in the Discworld series, because there's someone that we're just really keen to meet. What are we going to be reading, Liz?
We're going to be reading The We Free Men.
Yeah, which means we're going to meet Tiffany Aching. Yeah, finally.
Well, you're going to meet Tiffany Aching. I'm going to be.
Well, it's true.
But it's going to be so good. I'm really excited for you to meet her, and I cannot wait to get your impressions.
No, I think it's going to be great. If you've got questions for us about the We Free Men and Tiffany Aching, then you can ask us those via social media using the hashtag Pratchett32. If you've got any comments about this episode, then use the hashtag Pratchett31. And of course, you can also get in touch with us to ask us questions by sending us an email at chat@pratchettpodcast.com. But until next time, if you're out there stepping, whether you're going east or west, please mind the gap. You've been listening to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast with Pratchetters Elizabeth Flux, Ben McKenzie, that's me, and guest Joel Martin. Pratchett is produced and edited by me, with music by David Ashton of Sample & Hold Studios. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at Pratchett Podcast, and listen to past episodes and support the production of new ones via pratchettpodcast.com. Join the conversation for this episode using the hashtag Pratchett31.
Pratchett is brought to you by Splendid Chaps Productions. We make entertainment for your ears, like the Doctor Who podcast Splendid Chaps and time travel comedy series Night Terrors. To find out more, visit splendidchaps.com.